Hey guys, tonight we journey back 3 centuries before the fall of kings and the rise of bastards, to witness the forging of the 7 kingdoms themselves. The extraordinary tale of Aegon Targaryen, the last dragonlord of the known world, who looked across the narrow sea and saw not 7 separate realms, but one kingdom waiting to be born. A man who commanded fire made flesh, who turned castles to glass and kings to ash, yet whose greatest conquest was not of land but of destiny itself. This is the story of 3 dragons, 2 sister queens, and the Iron Throne that would define 1,000 years of Westeros. Of battles where the sky itself burned, and surrenders that saved more lives than any victory. The chronicle of how Aegon the Conqueror transformed from exile to emperor, and why his choices echo through every crown, every rebellion, every drop of royal blood spilled in the Game of Thrones. So before you settle in for this epic journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the hidden histories of Westeros. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what draws you most to the Age of Dragons. It's always fascinating to connect with fellow travelers through these ancient tales. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable under your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But know this from the start, the story you're about to hear is not the simple tale of conquest you might expect. For in the final days before his coronation, as Aegon stood alone in the throne room of the Red Keep, staring at the iron seat forged from 1,000 surrendered swords, he spoke words that would haunt the Targaryen line forever. Words about a dream that drove him westward, a vision of ice and fire that went far deeper than mere ambition for a crown. "I saw the end of everything," he whispered to the empty hall, his voice echoing off stone walls that had witnessed the birth of a dynasty. The long night returning, the dead walking, and only fire and blood standing between the realm and eternal darkness. "I conquered not for glory, but because the realm must be one when the true war comes." Yet what Aegon saw in those prophetic flames, what ancient terror drove the last dragonlord to abandon his island fortress and claim 7 kingdoms, remained locked in Targaryen secrets for 300 years. A mystery that would only reveal its true meaning when winter finally came, when the dead did walk, and when fire and ice met in the final battle for the dawn. But that ending lies far ahead in our tale. Tonight we begin at the beginning, on the volcanic shores of Dragonstone, where 3 dragons cast shadows across the narrow sea, and where a young king prepared to change the world forever. 300 years before the War of the 5 Kings, before the Red Wedding and the Purple Wedding, before bastards became kings and queens turned mad, the world was a different place. 7 kingdoms ruled by 7 kings, each believing their crown the truest, their claim the strongest, their castle the most impregnable. It was an age of endless war, where lords fought lords, kings fought kings, and the common folk knew no peace from one harvest to the next. But far to the east, on the ancient island fortress of Dragonstone, the last remnant of old Valyria clung to existence like a dying ember. Here, where volcanic stone met the narrow sea, where dragons had once filled the skies in numbers beyond counting, only 3 remained. 3 dragons, and 3 Targaryens to ride them. Dragonstone itself seemed carved from shadow and flame. Black stone walls rose from smoking peaks, their Valyrian architecture flowing like frozen fire. Gargoyles perched on impossible towers, their stone eyes forever watching the western horizon. The very air tasted of sulfur and salt, of ancient magic and dying empires. When storms rolled in from the narrow sea, they broke against these walls like waves against the shore of time itself. In the great hall of this fortress, beneath banners bearing the 3-headed dragon, sat Aegon Targaryen. 27 years old, with the silver-gold hair and violet eyes of old Valyria. He possessed a presence that filled any room he entered, yet those who knew him best understood that his true strength lay not in his imposing frame or royal bearing, but in the quiet intensity with which he studied the great painted table before him. This table, a masterwork of carved wood, displayed every hill and valley, every river and road of the Seven Kingdoms in exquisite detail. Aegon would spend hours tracing coastlines with his finger, memorizing the distances between castles, understanding the rhythms of a land he had never walked but somehow felt called to rule. The table had been his grandfather's obsession, his father's burden, and now it had become his destiny. Standing beside him always were his sister wives, the two women who shared not only his blood but his dreams of conquest. Visenya the Elder carried herself like the warrior she was. Dark where Aegon was light, stern where he was contemplative, she wore her sword as naturally as other ladies wore jewelry. Her dragon Vega was nearly as large as Aegon's own mount, and twice as fierce in battle. When Visenya spoke of conquest, it was always in terms of swift, decisive action. Rhaenys, the younger sister, possessed a different kind of power. Where Visenya commanded through strength, Rhaenys led through charm. Her silver hair fell in gentle waves. Her violet eyes sparkled with mischief and intelligence, and when she smiled, even hardened warriors forgot their grievances. Her dragon, Meraxes, was swift as lightning and beautiful as sunrise, perfectly matched to her rider's spirit. When Rhaenys spoke of conquest, she dreamed of the songs that would be sung, the culture that would flourish. Together, these three represented something the world had never seen. Not since the height of the Valyrian freehold had dragonlords worked in such perfect harmony. They were a trinity of power, each completing what the others lacked. Aegon provided the vision and the steady hand of leadership. Visenya brought the iron will necessary to enforce that vision. Rhaenys offered the grace to make conquest feel like liberation rather than subjugation. Yet for all their power, for all their dragons and Valyrian steel, they remained exiles. The last sparks of a flame that had once lit the known world, old Valyria lay in ruins, consumed by fire and chaos in the doom that had claimed every other dragonlord family. The Targaryens had survived only because they had fled westward before the catastrophe, establishing themselves on this lonely island when dragons still darkened the skies in their hundreds. Now, as Aegon studied his painted kingdoms, a different kind of burden weighed upon his shoulders. The dreams had grown stronger of late, more vivid, more urgent, visions of ice creeping south like a living thing, of darkness that devoured light, of the dead walking in numbers beyond counting. Ancient Valyrian prophecies spoke of a prince that was promised, one who would unite the realm against the coming darkness. But prophecies were riddles wrapped in shadows, and Aegon had learned not to trust their simple interpretations. What he did trust was the certainty growing in his heart that time was running short. The Seven Kingdoms might squabble among themselves for another 1,000 years, bleeding themselves white in endless petty wars, but there would come a day when they would need to stand as one or fall forever. Whether that day would come in his lifetime or his great-grandson's mattered less than ensuring the realm would be ready when winter finally showed its true face. Outside the great hall's windows, the sun was setting over Blackwater Bay, painting the western waters the color of dragonfire. Soon, very soon, Aegon knew he would have to make his choice. Remain safe on Dragonstone, the last dragonlord of a dead empire, or risk everything on a dream of unity that might save the world. The dream always began the same way. Aegon would find himself standing atop the wall, that ancient barrier of ice and magic stretching endlessly across the northern horizon. But this was not the wall as it existed in his waking world. This wall wept blood instead of water, its surface cracked and crumbling like old bone. Beyond it, darkness moved with purpose and hunger, a tide of shadow that swallowed stars as it advanced southward. In the dream, he could hear them coming, not footsteps, for the dead made no sound as they walked, but something far worse. the silence of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. Cities stood empty, their walls intact, but their people gone, claimed by an enemy that turned love into hate, life into undeath, hope into despair. The great castles of Westeros, Winterfell and Storm's End, Casterly Rock and Highgarden, all stood like monuments to futility against an enemy that feared no sword and felt no pain. But always, always in the dream, there came a moment when fire blazed across the darkness. Dragons in numbers beyond counting filled the sky, their flames turning night to day, their roars shaking the very foundations of the earth. And riding the greatest of these dragons, a figure in black and red, whose face remained forever hidden, a king who commanded not through fear, but through unity, not through conquest, but through sacrifice. The dream would end as Aegon watched this shadow king fall from the sky, his dragon's fire guttering out like a candle in a storm. Yet even in falling, even in dying, the king's sacrifice bought time, bought hope, bought a dawn that might otherwise never come. And in that final moment, as the dream faded and Aegon returned to waking, he would hear a voice speaking in Old Valyrian, words that seemed to come from the dragon itself. The prince that was promised shall unite the realm, for the realm must be one when the darkness comes. Fire and blood, ice and death, the song eternal sung in the key of sacrifice. For months now, these visions had haunted Aegon's sleep. At first he had dismissed them as products of a restless mind, the fears of a young man facing an impossible destiny. But as the dreams grew stronger, more detailed, more urgent, he began to understand that they were something else entirely. They were memory and prophecy combined, the dying whispers of ancient Valyrian seers whose blood flowed in his veins. The morning after the strongest dream yet, Aegon summoned his council to the chamber of the painted table. Here, in this circular room, where his ancestors had planned their escape from Valyria's doom, he would plan something far more ambitious, the conquest of an entire continent. Orys Baratheon entered first, as he always did. Aegon's bastard half-brother possessed the same black hair and blue eyes as their father, but where Aegon carried himself with the measured dignity of kings, Orys moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior. He had been Aegon's companion since childhood, his most trusted advisor, his closest friend. If Aegon was the mind of their enterprise, Orys would be its right hand. "You sent for me, brother," Orys said, settling into his customary chair. He had long ago stopped using formal titles when they were alone, understanding that Aegon valued honesty above ceremony. "I did. We need to talk about Westeros." Orys raised an eyebrow. They had talked about Westeros countless times before, studying its kingdoms, mapping its strengths and weaknesses, planning hypothetical campaigns that might never come to pass. But something in Aegon's tone suggested this conversation would be different. "The lords have been fighting again," Orys observed. "Ravens arrived this morning with news from across the narrow sea. King Argilac the Arrogant raids the Dornish marches, while King Harren the Black builds his new castle. The Reach and the Westerlands skirmish over river crossings, the same endless dance of petty ambition." "Exactly," Aegon replied, his fingers tracing the outline of King's Landing on the painted table. "They bleed themselves white, while the real enemy gathers strength in the far north. How many good men die in these meaningless wars? How many castles burn? How many harvests are lost? How many children grow up fatherless, because kings cannot see beyond their own pride?" Visenya entered as he spoke, her boots clicking against the stone floor with military precision. She wore riding leathers instead of a gown. Her sword, Darkfire, belted at her hip. Even in peaceful moments, she remained ready for war. "The dragons are restless," she announced without preamble. "Balerion especially. He circles the island every dawn, always facing west. Even Vhagar seems eager for open sky and new hunting grounds." "Dragons know their purpose," Rhaenys added. gliding into the chamber with her characteristic grace. Where Visenya dressed for battle, Rhaenys wore silk and silver, her beauty a weapon as sharp as any blade. They were born to rule the sky, not circle this lonely rock like caged birds. Aegon looked around the table at the three people he trusted most in the world. His brother by choice, his sisters by blood and marriage, his companions in dreams of empire. The moment had come to share with them the visions that drove him, the prophecies that haunted his sleep. "I have been dreaming," he began carefully. "Dreams of ice and darkness, of an enemy that comes not from across the sea but from beyond the wall, dreams of a realm that stands divided while death marches south, and of dragons that must fly west to forge the unity that will save the world." The chamber fell silent. All three of his companions knew of Aegon's Targaryen blood, the gift of prophetic dreams that had saved their house from Valyria's doom. They had seen him wake in cold sweats, heard him murmur in old Valyrian during restless nights, but this was the first time he had spoken openly of what those dreams contained. "You believe the old prophecies are true," Visenya said. It was not a question. "I believe the realm must be one when winter comes," Aegon replied. "Not the winter of seasons, but the winter that lasts a generation. The long night that will test every soul in Westeros. Whether that comes in my lifetime or my great-grandson's matters less than ensuring the Seven Kingdoms can stand as one when it arrives." Orys leaned forward, his strategic mind already working through the implications. 7 kingdoms, each with their own armies, their own traditions, their own pride. The logistics alone would be staggering. "We have 3 dragons, perhaps 10,000 men if we call in every favor and empty every treasury." "Numbers do not win wars," Rhaenys observed. "Fear wins wars, and nothing inspires fear quite like dragons." "Or loyalty," Visenya added. "Some will kneel from terror, others from wisdom. The clever ones will see the advantage of joining us rather than opposing us." Aegon nodded slowly. His sisters understood the duality of conquest, the balance between fire and diplomacy that would make their campaign possible. "We offer each kingdom a choice. Kneel and keep your lands, your titles, your traditions, resist and burn. Most will choose the former, especially once they see what happened to those who chose the latter." "And if we fail?" Orys asked quietly. "If we lose even one dragon, if the kingdoms unite against us, if the faith calls for holy war against Valyrian blood, then we die," Aegon said simply. "But we die attempting something worthy of our dragons and our blood. Better to fail in service of prophecy than to succeed at remaining irrelevant." The 4 companions spent the rest of that morning planning in earnest. Maps were unfurled, supply lists drawn up, potential allies identified. By noon, they had sketched the framework of a campaign that would either forge a dynasty or destroy the last dragonlords forever. As the sun reached its zenith, Aegon walked alone to the highest tower of Dragonstone, where Balerion waited. The great dragon raised his massive head as his rider approached, eyes like molten gold fixing on Aegon's face. In those ancient orbs, Aegon saw not just intelligence but understanding. Balerion had flown above old Valyria before the doom, had felt the pull of prophecy in his bones. He knew, as dragons always knew, that change was coming. "Tomorrow we fly west, old friend," Aegon whispered, placing his hand on the dragon's snout. "Tomorrow we begin the work that may save the world." The decision was made. The conquest would begin. The ships appeared on the horizon at dawn, black sails marked with the 3-headed dragon catching the first light of morning. Local fishermen hauling in their nets paused to count the vessels, their weathered faces growing pale as they realized what they were witnessing. 30 ships in all, carrying not just soldiers and supplies, but the makings of a new kingdom. At the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where 3 hills rose from the marshy ground like sleeping giants, Aegon Targaryen would plant his flag and build his first castle. The location had been chosen with characteristic precision, close enough to the sea for supply lines, positioned on high ground for defense, situated at the confluence of rivers that would allow rapid movement inland. Most importantly, it lay at the heart of the continent, equally distant from every corner of his future realm. The local lords had been expecting this moment for weeks. Ravens had flown from Dragonstone, carrying messages both diplomatic and direct, informing the masters of Duskendale, Maidenpool and Driftmark that Aegon Targaryen would soon require their counsel. Some had responded with pledges of support, others with carefully worded neutrality, a few with silence that spoke louder than defiance. Lord Darklyn of Duskendale was the first to ride out and meet the landing force. A cautious man, grown wealthy from controlling one of the few good harbors on the narrow sea, he understood better than most the value of choosing the winning side early. He brought with him a small escort and a large wagon filled with provisions, a gesture of goodwill that would be remembered favorably in the years to come. "Your Grace," Lord Darklyn said, dismounting from his horse and offering a respectful bow. He had practiced this greeting for days, unsure whether to address Aegon as Conqueror, King or Lord, finally settling on the title that acknowledged both ambition and courtesy. "Lord Darklyn," Aegon replied, his voice carrying easily across the beach where his men were unloading supplies. "Your hospitality is most welcome. I trust the roads between here and Duskendale remain safe for travelers." It was a simple question with complex implications. By asking about road safety, Aegon was really asking whether Lord Darklyn could guarantee safe passage for supply convoys, whether his men would patrol the routes, whether his allegiance was genuine or merely expedient. The older lord understood perfectly. "The roads are safe, Your Grace, and will remain so as long as I draw breath. My grandson will escort your supply trains personally, and my maester has prepared detailed maps of every path between here and the Trident." Within hours of the first ships making landfall, the beach transformed into a carefully organized hive of activity. Aegon's followers had learned much from their Valyrian ancestors about the logistics of empire building. Supplies were sorted and inventoried, defensive positions surveyed and fortified, quarters established for officers and common soldiers alike. This was not a raiding party seeking quick plunder, but the foundation of something permanent. The dragons remained aboard the ships during those first crucial hours, their presence felt rather than seen. Balerian's shadow occasionally passed over the landing site as he circled high above, a reminder to any watching enemies that this was no ordinary invasion force. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. By keeping the dragons hidden, Aegon forced his enemies to imagine their power rather than witness it, and imagination often proved more terrifying than reality. Lord Mouton of Maidenpool arrived the following morning with a larger escort and a more cautious demeanor. His lands controlled key river crossings that any army moving north would need to secure, making his allegiance particularly valuable. Unlike Lord Darklyn, he came with questions rather than provisions. "We have heard many tales of dragons, Your Grace," he said, after the formal greetings were complete. "But tales and truth are often distant cousins. Perhaps you might illuminate us as to the nature of your companions." The request was reasonable, the tone respectful, but Aegon recognized the challenge beneath the courtesy. Lord Mouton needed to see what he was allying himself with, needed to understand the power that would either protect or destroy his lands. More importantly, word of this demonstration would spread throughout the Riverlands within days, reaching the ears of every lord who still wavered in their loyalty. Visimia smiled as she stepped forward, her hand resting casually on Darkfire's hilt. "Perhaps a demonstration would be more illuminating than words, Your Grace." The nearby hill that would one day hold the great sept of Baelor became the stage for Westeros's introduction to Dragonfire. Rhaga descended from the clouds like a living storm, her bronze scales catching the afternoon sun as she landed with ground-shaking force. The assembled lords had seen horses, they had seen destriers, they had even seen the occasional auroch brought from the wild lands beyond the wall. But nothing had prepared them for a creature that combined the majesty of legend with the terrible reality of claws longer than swords and teeth that could crush stone. Lord Mouton took 3 steps backward without seeming to realize he had moved, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that would be less than useless against such a beast. His men shifted nervously, caught between the desire to flee and the shame of showing fear before their lord. Even the horses began to whicker and prance, their animal instincts screaming warnings about the apex predator now perched before them. Draikries, Vizinya commanded in the ancient tongue. The blast of flame that erupted from Vhagar's maw turned a section of the hillside into glass, the heat so intense that men standing 50 yards away felt their faces flush and their eyes water. The roar that accompanied the fire seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that resonated in bone and blood, marking itself permanently in the memory of every witness. When the flames died and the glass cooled, Lord Mouton found his voice again. "Your Grace has made your point most eloquently. House Mouton is at your service, now and always." The political implications rippled outward faster than the dragons could fly. By week's end, ravens carried word of the demonstration to every castle within 100 leagues. Some lords began gathering their armies. Others began crafting letters of submission. The clever ones started both, understanding that preparation for war and diplomacy for peace often went hand in hand. Lord Bar Emin of Sharp Point proved the most interesting of the early visitors. A bookish man more comfortable with ledgers than lances, he brought something more valuable than armed men or provisions. He brought information, maps showing the true strength of various kingdoms, copies of correspondence between rival lords, detailed accounts of recent battles and their casualties. Intelligence, Aegon understood, would prove as valuable as dragonfire in the coming campaign. "The Riverlands are ripe for liberation, Your Grace," Lord Bar Emin explained, as they reviewed his carefully compiled reports. "King Harren the Black bleeds them white with taxes to build his great castle, while offering nothing in return but the threat of violence. They remember better days under the old River Kings, before the Ironborn came with their axes and their reapers." The information proved invaluable as Aegon refined his strategy. The Riverlands would be his path into the heart of Westeros, but they could also become his strongest allies if properly courted. Unlike the other kingdoms, the Riverlands had no natural boundaries, no mountain ranges or deserts to define their borders. They existed at the mercy of their neighbors, which made them eager for a protector strong enough to guarantee their independence. Work began immediately on the fortification that would become known as the Aegon Fort. Unlike the great castles of Westeros with their thick walls and deep foundations, this structure was designed for a different kind of warfare. It prioritized height over thickness, visibility over protection, speed of construction over permanence. Most importantly, it featured a great tower with landing platforms sized for dragons, the first architecture in Westeros designed specifically for aerial cavalry. As the walls rose from the marshy ground, so too did Aegon's understanding of the task before him. Each lord who visited brought news of the kingdoms beyond the Riverlands, stories of ancient feuds and recent alliances, tales of proud kings who would never kneel and pragmatic lords who might be convinced to switch sides. The Seven Kingdoms were not a single enemy to be defeated, but a complex web of relationships to be unraveled and rewoven with dragon thread. The first raven bearing threats arrived on the 10th day. King Harren the Black, master of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, had finally learned of the dragon landing in his domain. His message was brief and brutal in its simplicity. "Aegon Targaryen, you trespass on land sworn to House Har. Withdraw immediately. or face the consequences of defying the rightful king of the isles and rivers, know that my castle stands finished, with walls 40 feet thick and towers taller than mountains. Your dragons are beasts, nothing more, and beasts can be caged or killed like any other animal." Aegon read the message aloud to his assembled war council, his voice betraying no emotion even as Orys Baratheon snorted with amusement and Visenia's eyes flashed with anticipation. Only Rhaenys seemed troubled by the arrogance of the Ironborn king. 40-foot walls, she mused. He truly believes stone can stop dragonfire. How tragic that such ambition should be paired with such ignorance. The die was cast. King Harren had made his choice, and now Aegon would make his. The conquest would continue, and the first true test of dragons against castles would come sooner than expected. The greatest army ever assembled in the history of Westeros stretched across the golden fields south of the Blackwater like a living sea of steel and banners. 55,000 men had answered the call when King Mern Knightus the Breach and King Loren Noise of the Rock declared their alliance against the Targaryen pretender. Knights of the Reach rode beneath flowers and fruits, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their lances decorated with ribbons that fluttered in the morning breeze. Beside them marched the disciplined ranks of the Westerlands, their crimson cloaks marked with golden lions, their weapons forged from the finest steel that Lannister gold could buy. It was an army that could have conquered kingdoms, could have swept away any force that had ever taken the field in Westeros. Lords who had feuded for generations rode side by side, united by the threat of dragons and the promise of shared glory. The great houses were all represented here. Gardner and Lannister, Tarly and Crakehall, Hightower and Liddon, each contributing their finest warriors to this grand alliance. King Mern himself was a man in his prime, 40 years old, with the golden hair and green eyes that marked him as a true son of the Reach. He had ruled for 20 years, leading his kingdom through prosperity and peace, expanding trade routes and strengthening alliances. His knights loved him for his generosity, his lords respected him for his wisdom, his people cherished him for his just rule. In any other age, he would have been remembered as one of the great kings of Westeros. King Loren was younger, but no less accomplished. A veteran of the border wars who had proven his courage in a dozen battles. The wealth of Casterly Rock flowed through his veins like liquid gold, but he had never allowed riches to make him soft. His personal guard was composed of men who had fought beside him in the hills of the Westerlands, warriors who would follow him into the Seven Hells if he commanded it. Together these two kings commanded not just armies but the loyalty of millions. The Reach fed half of Westeros with its golden grain, while the Rock's mines produced the gold that drove trade throughout the known world. Their alliance represented power both military and economic, a combination that should have been unstoppable. Against this mighty host, Aegon Targaryen could field barely 10,000 men. Soldiers from Dragonstone and the Narrow Sea Islands, sellswords hired with Valyrian gold, volunteers drawn by the promise of adventure and plunder. They were outnumbered more than 5 to 1, facing odds that would have sent any sane commander into immediate retreat. Yet Aegon did not retreat. On the morning of the battle he stood on a rise overlooking the field where destiny would be decided, watching as the allied army deployed in perfect formation. His own forces looked pitifully small by comparison, a few scattered battalions against an ocean of enemies. But Aegon was not looking at the men below. His eyes were fixed on the sky above, where 3 shapes circled like deadly stars. Orys Baratheon rode up beside him, his destrier snorting and pawing the ground as if sensing the tension in the air. The scouts report their final numbers. Brother, 55,000, perhaps more. Every great house of the Reach and the Rock is represented down there. Good, Aegon replied calmly. When they kneel, it will be a kneeling worth having. And if they don't kneel? If they choose to die fighting? Aegon was quiet for a long moment. his violet eyes reflecting depths that seemed older than his years. Then they die fighting, and their sons will kneel over their graves. Either way, the realm will be one step closer to unity. The battle began with all the pageantry and honor that chivalric warfare demanded. Heralds rode between the armies exchanging formal challenges, knights displayed their banners with pride, commanders gave speeches about glory and duty and the favor of the gods. It was war as the great lords preferred it, conducted according to ancient rules that made death seem noble rather than wasteful. King Mern led the center himself, his golden banner snapping in the wind as 20,000 Reach Knights formed up behind him. To his left, King Loring commanded the Westerland's heavy cavalry, their lances glinting like a forest of steel in the morning sun. The flanks were held by disciplined infantry, archers, and the war machines that had served the great houses faithfully for centuries. Aegon's response was simple and devastating. He gave no speeches, issued no challenges, displayed no banners beyond the three-headed dragon that marked him as the last heir of old Valyria. Instead, he raised his hand toward the sky and spoke a single word in the ancient tongue: Dracarys. The dragons descended from the clouds like falling stars, but stars that burned with an inner fire that turned day to night and night to blazing noon. Balerion came first, the black dread, whose wings cast shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Behind him flew Vigar with Visenya on her back, the she-dragon's bronze scales gleaming as she banked into her attack run. Last came Meraxes, swift and silver, carrying Rhaenys into her first true battle with songs of flame and glory. Nothing in the long history of warfare had prepared the allied army for what happened next. Dragonfire was not like the flames of siege engines or wildfire pots, contained and directed. It was liquid death that flowed across the battlefield like water, seeking every gap in armor, every space between shields, every refuge that men thought might keep them safe. Steel melted like candle wax, horses screamed as their riders became living torches, and the carefully ordered ranks of the greatest army in Westeros dissolved into chaos. King Mern died in the first pass, his golden banner consumed in flames that burned so hot they turned sand to glass. The king who had ruled justly for 20 years, who had brought peace to the Reach and prosperity to his people, became ash in seconds. His knights tried to rally around his fallen standard, but Dragonfire knows no loyalty, recognizes no courage, makes no distinction between king and commoner. King Loren proved luckier. If surviving the destruction of everything you hold dear can be called luck. His horse fell burning beneath him, but his men dragged him clear of the worst flames, surrounded him with shields, and began the desperate retreat that would save his life while costing him his crown. The sight of the Rock's golden lions fleeing the field would haunt him for the rest of his days. The battle, if it could truly be called a battle, lasted less than an hour. When the dragons finally banked away from the field and landed near Aegon's position, they left behind a scene that would be remembered in song and story for 1,000 years. The Field of Fire, men would call it, though fire implied something natural, something that might eventually be extinguished. What the dragons had unleashed was more elemental than fire, more final than death. 4,000 men died that day, their bodies reduced to ash and memory. The survivors, those fortunate enough to have been on the edges of the battlefield when the dragons struck, wandered the scorched earth in a daze, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. These were veterans who had seen warfare in all its forms, but this had been something beyond war, beyond human understanding. Among the survivors was Ser Edmund Tully, a young knight who had ridden with the Reach contingent more from a sense of adventure than political conviction. He would live to be 90, serving faithfully as Lord Paramount of the Riverlands under 5 Targaryen kings, but he never spoke of what he saw that day without his hands shaking. The memory of men turning to ash while their screams still echoed in the air was not something the human mind was designed to process. King Loren's surrender came at sunset, delivered by a herald who could barely speak through his terror. The King of the Rock, whose ancestors had ruled from Casterly Rock for centuries, whose gold had made him the equal of any monarch in the known world, knelt in the mud before a man half his age and begged for mercy he had no right to expect. "I yield," he said simply, his voice hoarse from smoke and grief. "House Lannister yields to House Targaryen. I surrender my crown, my lands, my armies, everything I have or might claim to Aegon of House Targaryen, first of his name." Aegon accepted the submission with the same calm he had shown before the battle, but those who knew him well could see the weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders. Victory had come exactly as he had planned, but the cost in human life, the sheer scale of destruction, troubled him in ways his enemies could never understand. "Rise, Lord Loren," he said formally, using the title that acknowledged both defeat and continued authority. "Your lands and titles are confirmed. Your men will be treated with honor. Your house will serve as Warden of the West under the Iron Throne. The Rock's gold will flow again, but now it flows in service to a united realm." As night fell over the field of fire, ravens took wing carrying news that would shake every castle in Westeros. The dragons had proven their terrible power, 2 kings were dead or broken, and the conquest had truly begun. In the great halls where lords gathered to hear the reports, men who had scoffed at tales of Valyrian fire beasts now listened in silence, understanding that the world had changed forever in a single afternoon. But Aegon found no joy in his victory. That night, as he walked alone among the cooling ashes where 50,000 men had stood that morning, he whispered words that only the dead could hear. "Forgive me," he said to the wind and the darkness, "but the realm must be one when winter comes, and sometimes unity can only be bought with fire and blood." News of the field of fire spread through the riverlands like wildfire, carried by fleeing survivors and frightened ravens alike. In the great halls of Riverrun and Stonehenge, lords who had served House Hoare for generations gathered around their hearths and spoke in hushed whispers about dragons that turned armies to ash. The comfortable certainty of their world had been shattered in a single afternoon, leaving them to contemplate allegiances that had once seemed as permanent as the rivers themselves. Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun was the first to understand what the dragon victory truly meant. A man of middle years with the auburn hair and blue eyes that marked his ancient lineage, he had ruled his lands wisely, but always in the shadow of Harrenhal's black towers. The Ironborn had conquered the Riverlands through blood and terror, demanding tribute that bled the fertile valleys white, while giving nothing in return but the promise of violence against those who resisted. The raven that brought news of King Mern's death arrived at Riverrun as Lord Edmund sat in council with his bannermen, reviewing the latest demands from King Harren: taxes for the completion of his great castle, levies of young men for his armies, tribute of grain and gold that left the Riverlands perpetually on the edge of famine. The lords had been discussing whether to send another petition to Harrenhal, begging for relief that would never come. Lord Tytos Blackwood, whose ancient seat at Raventry Hall had weathered 1,000 storms, was the first to speak after the raven's message was read aloud. "If the dragons can burn 50,000 men in an hour, what chance does Harren have behind his walls? Stone may not burn, but the men defending it certainly will." "You speak of treason," Lord Bracken said carefully, though his words carried no real conviction. The eternal feud between Blackwood and Bracken had been set aside countless times when greater threats emerged, and both houses understood that King Harren represented a far greater danger to their lands than any ancient rivalry. "I speak of survival," Lord Blackwood replied. "My maester has corresponded with learned men across the narrow sea. They remember the dragonlords of old Valyria, the empire that ruled half the known world through fire and flight. If Aegon Targaryen truly carries that blood, then we are witnessing the return of powers not seen since the Doom itself." Lord Edmund listened to the debate with growing certainty. The Riverlands had always been the battleground where greater powers settled their differences, too central to be ignored, too divided to resist effectively. But now, for the first time in generations, they had a chance to choose their own fate rather than have it chosen for them. "Send ravens to every holdfast between here and the Twins," he commanded. "Lords Blackwood and Bracken will ride with me to meet this Dragon King. If we move quickly, we can be the ones who bring the Riverlands into his peace rather than wait for him to take them by conquest." The decision to abandon King Harren was not made lightly. The Ironborn King had ruled the Riverlands for nearly 40 years, and his justice, though harsh, had been consistent. Under his rule, the ancient feuds between river lords had been suppressed, trade along the rivers had flourished, and the constant raids from neighboring kingdoms had ceased. But prosperity built on fear was always fragile, and the lords had long chafed under foreign rule. 3 days after the Field of Fire, a delegation of river lords rode south to meet Aegon's advancing army. They traveled light and fast, taking ancient paths through forests where their ancestors had hunted before the coming of the Andals. These were roads that had seen the passage of kings and heroes for thousands of years, and now they would witness another turning of history's wheel. The meeting took place at the crossroads where the river road met the King's Road, a place of ancient significance where travelers had left offerings to the old gods for time beyond memory. Here, beside a heart tree whose face had watched empires rise and fall, the lords of the Riverlands would choose their destiny. Aegon received them with the courtesy due to men of noble birth, but also with the confidence of a conqueror who knew his strength. He had learned much from his victory over the combined armies of Reach and Rock, understanding now that mercy shown to those who surrendered willingly would encourage others to make the same choice. The Riverlands could become his strongest allies if properly courted, or his most troublesome enemies if driven to desperation. "My lords," he said, as they dismounted from their horses, "I am told you come seeking audience with one who would be your king. But I see before me men who are already kings in their own right, masters of lands that have known freedom since the dawn of days. What brings you so far from your halls to treat with a stranger?" Lord Edmund stepped forward as the chosen spokesman, his words carefully prepared but delivered with genuine conviction. "Your Grace, we come not as subjects seeking mercy, but as allies offering partnership. The Riverlands have groaned under Ironborn rule for too long. Our harvests feed Harren's ambitions while our people go hungry. Our sons die in his wars, while our daughters are given as prizes to his captains. And yet you served him faithfully until yesterday," Aegon observed. "What has changed, save the color of the banners in the field?" "What has changed, Your Grace, is hope," Lord Blackwood interjected. "For 40 years we have endured because we had no choice. Now suddenly we do. The dragons have returned to the world, and with them the possibility of a different future." Aegon studied the assembled lords carefully, reading the mix of desperation and determination in their faces. These were not men driven by simple opportunism, but leaders who genuinely believed they were acting in their people's best interests. The Riverlands had been conquered before, by Storm Kings and Iron Kings and Kings of Winter, but they had always eventually returned to independence. Perhaps this time could be different. "I will not lie to you about what I offer," Aegon said finally. "I come with fire and blood, with dragons that can melt the strongest castle and armies that follow my banner, but I also come with peace. The eternal wars between your houses will end. The raids across your borders will cease. Your harvests will feed your own people before they feed distant masters." The negotiations that followed were complex but brief. Unlike the Ironborn, who had imposed their rule through conquest alone, Aegon understood the importance of legitimacy. The Riverlords would keep their lands and titles, their traditional rights and privileges. In return, they would swear fealty to House Targaryen, provide men for the royal armies, and help govern a united realm. Most importantly, they would be partners in the great work of unification rather than mere subjects. The Riverland's central position made them vital to controlling the continent, but their political fragmentation made them vulnerable to outside interference. Under Targaryen rule, they would have the protection of dragons combined with the autonomy to manage their own affairs. Lord Bracken raised the question that haunted all their minds, and King Harren. He will not simply allow the Riverlands to slip from his grasp. Harrenhal commands every river crossing between here and the Twins. His armies may be smaller than those you faced at the Field of Fire, but they fight from behind walls 40 feet thick. Walls built by men can be brought down by dragons, Aegon replied simply. King Harren has made his choice by ignoring my peaceful overtures. Now he must live with the consequences of that choice. However briefly, the oath-swearing took place at sunset as the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared above the Heart Tree. One by one, the lords of the Riverlands knelt before Aegon Targaryen and spoke the ancient words that would bind their houses to his for generations to come. Lords Tully and Blackwood, Bracken and Vance, Mallister and Frey, each adding their strength to the growing coalition that would reshape Westeros. As the ceremony concluded, and the lords departed for their various holdings, Aegon remained beside the Heart Tree, studying the carved face that seemed to watch him with ancient wisdom. In the growing darkness, he could almost hear the whispers of those who had stood in this place before him, other kings and conquerors who had sought to unite the fractured lands of Westeros. The easy victories are behind us now, he murmured to Orys, who had remained quietly at his side throughout the negotiations. Harren will not kneel, and after him comes the real test. The North remembers every slight, the Vale trusts no outsider, and Dorne has never bowed to any king. But the Riverlands are ours now, Orys replied, and with them, the heart of the continent. Let the other kingdoms rage and posture. When winter comes, they will need the unity you offer, whether they want it or not. Above them, Valyrian's roar echoed across the darkening sky, a sound that sent rabbits scurrying into their burrows and made the horses shift nervously at their picket lines. The Black Dread was hungry for battle, eager to test his flames against the impossible towers of Harrenhal. Soon, very soon, he would have his chance. The Riverlands had chosen their side, but one king remained who believed stone could stand against dragons. Tomorrow they would ride north to prove him wrong. The morning mist clung to the waters of God's Eye like the breath of ancient spirits swirling around the base of towers that scraped the very belly of the clouds. Harrenhal loomed above the lake in all its impossible majesty, a testament to human ambition that dwarfed every other structure ever built in the known world. Its 5 massive towers rose like the fingers of a stone giant, while walls thick enough to house entire villages stretched between them in graceful curves that defied both nature and reason. King Harren the Black stood atop the Kingspire Tower, as he had every dawn for the past 40 years, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had achieved the impossible. From this height, the greatest lords of Westeros would appear as insects crawling across his lands, their mightiest castles reduced to children's toys scattered across the landscape. He had built more than a fortress, he had created a monument to the supremacy of iron will over natural limitation. The castle had consumed 4 decades of his life, and the wealth of 2 kingdoms, but every stone had been placed with purpose, every tower raised with deliberate intent. Where other kings built for defense, Harren had built for eternity. Where other lords constructed keeps that might withstand siege for months, he had created something that could endure for millennia, a permanent reminder that House Hall would never be erased from the annals of history. The great curtain walls rose 200 feet from the lakeshore, their surface so perfectly smooth that not even the most skilled climber could find purchase between the fitted stones. Murder holes commanded every approach, while the gates were protected by triple portcullises forged from iron that had been mined beneath the Iron Islands themselves. The towers were positioned with mathematical precision, their overlapping fields of fire ensuring that no enemy could approach unseen or unchallenged. Most impressive of all was the sheer scale of the construction. The Hall of 100 Hearths could feast 5,000 men at a single sitting, while the kitchens were large enough to prepare food for an entire army. The stables could house 1,000 destriers, the armories contained enough weapons to equip 50,000 soldiers, and the granaries held sufficient supplies to sustain a siege lasting decades. Harrenhal was not merely a castle but a city enclosed within walls, a complete civilization contained within a single structure. Yet for all its grandeur, Harrenhal suffered from the same weakness that afflicted all works of human ambition. It had been built by men who understood stone and steel, mortar and mathematics, but who had never witnessed the true power of dragons unleashed in anger. The walls that seemed so formidable had been designed to withstand conventional siege engines, not flames that burned hotter than the forges of the gods themselves. The raven that brought Aegon's final ultimatum arrived with wings singed by the speed of its flight, bearing words that would be remembered long after the stones of Harrenhal had crumbled to dust. The message was brief, formal, and utterly without compromise. Yield the castle and live as a lord under the Iron Throne, or face the consequences of defying dragons in their fury. Harren's response was equally brief and infinitely more foolish. Tell the boy that stone does not burn, and neither do the men who built it. Let him come with his flying lizards and learn why the Ironborn have never bowed to southern weakness. The words carried a terrible irony that would become apparent within hours. The very stones of Harrenhal had been quarried using techniques learned from Valyrian stonemasons, shaped by fires that burned hotter than any natural flame. The castle owed its existence to dragonfire, yet its master believed it could withstand the power that had helped create it. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, 3 shadows appeared on the western horizon, growing larger with each passing moment until even the watchers on the highest towers could make out the distinctive silhouettes of dragons approaching their prey. Balerion led the formation, his black wings blotting out sections of sky, as he banked toward the castle that had been built to mock the very concept of aerial assault. Behind him came Vhagar and Meraxes, their bronze and silver scales catching the sunlight like burnished metal as they prepared to demonstrate the futility of trusting in walls and gates. The attack began without fanfare or ceremony, as natural and inevitable as the tide returning to shore. The dragons opened their mouths and released streams of fire that transformed the very air around Harrenhal into a furnace capable of melting stone. What followed challenged every assumption about the permanence of human construction, the reliability of defensive architecture, and the wisdom of defying powers beyond mortal comprehension. The great walls that had taken decades to build began to sag and flow like heated wax, their carefully fitted stones expanding at different rates until the perfect masonry cracked and split like eggshells. Windows designed to provide light and air became channels for superheated gases that turned the castle's interior into a maze of furnaces. The murder holes that were meant to rain death upon attackers instead became vents through which the defenders' own fortifications breathed fire back at them. In the Hall of 100 Hearths, the ironwork that held the great roof beams began to glow cherry red, then white hot, before finally flowing like liquid metal onto the floor below. Tapestries that had taken years to weave disappeared in seconds, their threads consumed by temperatures that reduced everything organic to ash and memory. The great tables where kings had feasted became pyres, while the throne where Harren had dispensed justice melted into an unrecognizable puddle of twisted metal. Throughout the castle, men discovered that armor offered no protection against heat that could penetrate steel as easily as cloth. Knights who had never known fear found themselves trapped in suits of metal that became ovens, cooking them alive within their own protection. Servants fled through corridors that had become furnaces, only to find that every exit led to flames that burned beyond the power of water or sand to extinguish. King Harren himself died in the Kingspire Tower, the tallest structure he had ever built, becoming his funeral pyre, as the stones around him glowed like coals and the very air became too hot to breathe. His final words, if he spoke any, were lost in the roar of flames that consumed not just his castle but his dynasty, his legacy, and his dreams of immortality through architecture. The 5 towers of Harrenhal became 5 candles lighting the darkness, their glow visible from leagues away, as the greatest castle ever built learned the lesson that stone could indeed burn when subjected to fires that exceeded all earthly comparison. The lake itself began to steam as heated stones fell into its waters, creating clouds of vapor that rose like the ghosts of the thousands who had labored to build what dragons destroyed in hours. When dawn came, Harrenhal still stood, but it stood transformed. The walls remained upright, but twisted into impossible shapes. Their surfaces rippled like water frozen in time. The towers still scraped the sky, but their perfect symmetry had been replaced by organic curves that seemed to flow rather than rise. Windows had become abstract openings that defied geometric description, while doorways had warped into shapes that hurt to look upon. Aegon walked through the transformed castle as the stones still crackled with residual heat, his boots crunching on glass that had once been windows and stepping carefully around pools of metal that had once been weapons. In what had been the great hall, he found the remains of Harren's throne, now nothing more than a twisted sculpture that bore no resemblance to the seat of power it had once been. "Let this be remembered," he said to the empty air, his words echoing strangely in chambers whose acoustics had been fundamentally altered by the dragon attack. No castle is strong enough to defy dragons, no wall thick enough to stop dragonfire, no king proud enough to survive the flames of defiance. The lesson of Harrenhal would echo through the ages, a reminder carved in twisted stone and melted metal that human ambition, however grand, remained subject to powers that transcended mortal understanding. The greatest castle ever built had become the greatest ruin, its magnificence transformed into a monument to the folly of believing that anything made by human hands could stand forever against the fury of dragons. The Riverlands belonged to Aegon now, their lords freed from iron rule and ready to swear new oaths to dragon kings. But the price of that freedom lay written in the stones of Harrenhal, where King Harren the Black had learned too late that stone could indeed burn, and that pride was kindling for the fires of conquest. High in the mountains of the moon, where ancient peaks scraped the sky and eagles built their nests above the clouds themselves, Queen Shara Arryn stood upon the battlements of the Eyrie and gazed down at a world spread far below her feet. From this height, the greatest castles of men looked like children's toys, the mightiest rivers appeared as silver threads, and even dragons would seem no larger than ravens soaring through distant valleys. The Eyrie was not merely impregnable, it was unreachable, a fortress built not by human ambition, but by the gods themselves from living stone. At 34 years of age, Queen Shara ruled the Vale of Arryn in her young son's name, and she ruled it with a wisdom that had kept her kingdom prosperous, while others bled themselves white in endless wars. The Vale had always stood apart from the struggles that plagued the other kingdoms, protected by mountains that made invasion nearly impossible, and blessed with fertile valleys that fed her people well. Where other rulers schemed for advantage, Queen Shara simply governed, trusting in the ancient strength of her house and the natural barriers that surrounded her lands. Her son, King Ronal Arryn, was only 7 years old but already showed the keen intelligence that had marked the Falcon Kings for generations. Golden-haired and blue-eyed like his mother, he spent his days learning swordplay from the Knights of the Vale and statecraft from the wisest maesters in the 7 kingdoms. In time he would become a great king, but for now he remained a child, content to fly his hawks from the castle's highest towers and dream of adventures beyond the mountain walls. The news of dragon fire at Harrenhal had reached the Vale within days of the Great Burning, carried by ravens that arrived with wings singed by their desperate flight from the devastation. Queen Shara had read the reports with growing concern, understanding that the world beyond her mountain stronghold had changed forever. Dragons had returned to Westeros, and with them came a conqueror who seemed determined to unite the seven kingdoms under his rule, whether they wished it or not. "The Riverlands have fallen," announced Lord Corin Corbray as he entered the Queen's solar, his weathered face grim with the weight of unwelcome news. As her most trusted advisor and the finest knight in the Vale, his counsel carried great weight in all matters of war and diplomacy. "Lord Tully sends word that he has bent the knee to this Targaryen pretender, and the other river lords have followed his example." "Pretender?" Queen Shara asked with a slight smile. "A man who commands 3 dragons and has burned the greatest castle in Westeros seems to have moved somewhat beyond pretension, my lord. Perhaps we should call him by his chosen title, and consider what that means for the Vale." The Queen's pragmatism was not born of cowardice, but of clear-eyed assessment of reality. She had received Aegon's letters, read his offers of alliance, studied the terms he proposed for those kingdoms that submitted willingly. Unlike the Ironborn king who had died in his melted tower, she understood that pride was a luxury her people could not afford if it meant their destruction. But the Vale's unique position presented challenges that other kingdoms did not face. The mountain passes that protected them from invasion also isolated them from potential allies. The very defensibility that had kept them safe for centuries now threatened to become a trap if the dragons decided to demonstrate their power against the Eyrie itself. "What of the other kingdoms?" she asked, settling into her chair beside the window that offered a commanding view of the sky approaches to her castle. "Have any others declared for this dragon king?" King Loren of the Rock bent the knee after his defeat at the Field of Fire. Lord Corbray replied, consulting the scrolls that never seemed to leave his hands these days. "The Reach burns without a king, its great lords squabbling over the succession while Aegon's armies occupy Highgarden. The North remains silent, but Lord Stark masses his armies at the Twins. The Iron Islands rage and raid without direction, now that Harren is dead." And Dawn. Princess Meria sends her regrets that she cannot attend Aegon's coronation, along with a gift of Dornish wine, and a promise that any Targaryen who ventures south of the Red Mountains will receive a warm welcome. The knight's dry tone suggested exactly what kind of welcome the Dornish princess had in mind. Queen Shara absorbed this information with the careful attention she gave to all matters of statecraft. The political landscape of Westeros was shifting with unprecedented speed, old alliances crumbling while new ones formed around the dragon banners. The Vale could not remain neutral forever, but choosing sides required understanding which side was likely to prevail in the long term. "Send a raven to Dragonstone," she commanded, after a long moment of consideration. "Inform King Aegon that Queen Shara Arryn requests the honor of a meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest. We shall receive him here, in the Eyrie, where kings and queens may speak as equals." The invitation, when it arrived at Aegon's camp, sparked immediate debate among his counselors. The journey to the Eyrie was treacherous even for those familiar with the mountain paths, and the castle's position made it effectively immune to conventional siege. If the Arryns chose treachery, they could easily dispose of their guests with a simple push from the moon door, sending them tumbling thousands of feet to their deaths on the rocks below. "It's a trap," Auras declared bluntly, as they gathered around the campaign table in Aegon's tent. "No one summons a conqueror to treat with them in their own stronghold unless they plan some mischief. The Eyrie may be impregnable, but it's also perfectly positioned for an ambush." or it's the gesture of a queen who understands that diplomacy requires meeting on equal terms, Rhaenys countered. The Vale has remained neutral in every war for the past century. They've never attacked their neighbors, never sought conquest beyond their borders. Perhaps Queen Shara simply wishes to negotiate in good faith. Aegon studied the map spread before him, tracing the mountain paths that led up to the ancient seat of House Arryn. The journey would take days, even by dragon, following treacherous routes through passes where a single misstep could prove fatal. But the symbolic value of being received at the Eyrie, of treating with the Arryns as equals rather than conquering them through force, appealed to his long-term vision of unity. I will go, he decided finally. But not alone. Visenya will accompany me, along with a small honor guard. If Queen Shara means to demonstrate the Vale's independence, we shall demonstrate that dragons fear no mountain castle, however high. The flight to the Eyrie tested even Balerian's strength, the great dragon laboring to gain altitude as the mountain peaks rose around them like the teeth of some primordial giant. The air grew thin and cold, forcing both dragon and rider to pause frequently during the ascent. Below them, the narrow paths carved into the mountainside looked like scratches made by a child's fingernail, barely wide enough for men to walk single file. But the view from the Eyrie's courtyard justified every moment of the difficult journey. Standing on the platform where countless Aryan kings had received homage from their vassals, Aegon could see the entirety of the Vale spread below like a green jewel set in a crown of stone. Rivers wound through fertile valleys where golden grain rippled in the mountain breezes, while small towns and holdfasts dotted the landscape like scattered coins. It was a realm worth protecting, a kingdom worth preserving. Queen Shara received him in the High Hall, a chamber whose architecture seemed to merge seamlessly with the living rock of the mountain itself. Tall windows opened onto empty air, allowing mountain winds to whistle through the space while providing breathtaking views of the world far below. The queen herself sat upon the weirwood throne, carved from a single massive trunk by the first Arryn kings, its pale wood gleaming in the afternoon light. "Your Grace," she said formally, rising to greet her guest with the courtesy due to a visiting monarch. "The Vale of Arryn welcomes you to the Eyrie. We trust your journey was not too taxing for one accustomed to more civilized travel." The subtle mockery in her words was delivered with such grace that it seemed almost complimentary, a reminder that she was receiving him in her own stronghold, where she set the terms of engagement. Aegon appreciated the skill required to issue such a challenge, while maintaining perfect diplomatic protocol. "Your Grace honors me with this invitation," he replied, with equal formality. "Though I confess the Vale's beauty can only be truly appreciated from the sky. Your kingdom is indeed blessed by the gods." Young King Ronald had been presented at the beginning of the audience, but he had remained unusually quiet during the formal exchanges, his wide eyes fixed on something beyond the windows. Only when a shadow passed across the courtyard did his composure finally break. "Mother," he whispered urgently, tugging at Queen Shara's sleeve. "Mother, there are dragons outside, real dragons, just like in the stories." The boy's innocent wonder broke the careful tension of diplomatic ceremony, reminding everyone present that beneath all the politics and protocol, they were witnessing something genuinely miraculous. Dragons had not been seen in the Vale for centuries, existing only in ancient tapestries and half-remembered songs. To a 7-year-old boy, their presence was not a threat to be calculated, but a dream made manifest. "Indeed there are, my son," Queen Shara replied gently, her maternal instincts overriding her political caution. "Would you like to see them more closely?" What followed was perhaps the most unusual negotiation in the history of Westeros. Instead of debating terms in the formal confines of the throne room, Queen Shara and King Aegon found themselves standing in the Eyrie's courtyard while young Ronald peppered the Dragon King with questions about his magnificent beasts. The boy's excitement was infectious. His delight in seeing creatures from legend made real, softening the hearts of adults who had come prepared for stern diplomacy. "Can I ride one?" Ronald asked with the directness that only children possess. "Just once around the castle. I promise I won't fall off." The request was so unexpected, so completely outside the normal bounds of diplomatic protocol, that even Visenya smiled despite herself. Here was a king who feared no dragon, a child whose first instinct upon seeing creatures of legend was not terror but wonder. Perhaps there was wisdom in innocence that adults had forgotten in their careful calculations of power and politics. "Would you like to see the Vale as the eagles see it?" Aegon asked gently, extending his hand to the young king. "I promise to keep you safe." The flight lasted only minutes. A brief circuit of the castle that allowed Ronald to see his kingdom from a perspective no Arryn had ever enjoyed. But in those minutes, the political landscape of Westeros shifted once again. When they landed and the boy ran to his mother with stories of clouds and wind and the world spread like a tapestry below, Queen Shara understood that her choice had been made for her. "The Vale will bend the knee to House Targaryen," she announced formally, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "But not from fear of dragons or defeat in battle. We kneel because we have seen that you rule not through terror alone, but through wonder as well. The realm needs kings who can inspire as well as conquer." Beyond the neck, where the ancient Crannog dwellers guarded the narrow causeway that separated the north from the southern kingdoms, Torrhen Stark sat in judgment at Winterfell, as his ancestors had done for 8,000 years. The great hall echoed with the voices of bannermen who had ridden from every corner of his vast domain, from the frozen shores of the Bay of Seals to the shadow of the wall itself. These were the Lords of Winter, men whose bloodline stretched back to the dawn of memory, whose loyalty had been tested in wars against wildlings and others, kings and pretenders, ice and fire. The king in the north possessed a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding it. At 42 years of age, Torrhen had ruled for nearly 2 decades, leading his people through harsh winters and brief summers with a steady wisdom that had made House Stark legendary throughout Westeros. His grey eyes held depths that spoke of ancient knowledge, while his brown hair, streaked with early silver, marked him as a man who had seen both triumph and sorrow. He wore no crown save in the most formal ceremonies, needing no symbol of authority beyond the respect his people freely gave. Around the long tables of Winterfell, the greatest houses of the north had gathered to debate the crisis that threatened their ancient independence. Lords Manderly and Dustin, Karstark and Umber, Reed and Mormont, each representing territories larger than some southern kingdoms, each commanding the loyalty of thousands of fighting men who had never bowed to any authority beyond the Starks of Winterfell. The north had remained unconquered since the days of the first men, too vast to hold, too proud to yield, too harsh for southern armies to endure. Lord Cregan Umber of Last Hearth, whose family had guarded the gift for generations, spoke first with the bluntness that characterized the mountain clans. "Your Grace, word from the south grows stranger with each raven. They say this Targaryen has dragons that melt castles like snow in spring, that he's already claimed 5 of the 7 kingdoms. If half these tales are true, we face an enemy unlike any the North has ever known." "Tales," growled Lord Roderick Dustin from his seat near the great hearth. "Southern lords love their songs and stories. I've fought ironborn raiders and wildling armies, and I've never seen fire that could melt stone. Dragons are beasts, nothing more. Large beasts, perhaps, but beasts nonetheless." Lord Wylis Manderly, whose house had fled the Reach centuries ago to find sanctuary in the north, possessed a different perspective shaped by his family's origins in the dragonlord's former domains. "My lords, with respect, my ancestors served the Gardener Kings when Valyria still ruled half the known world. The dragonlords were not mere beastmasters, but sorcerers who commanded powers beyond mortal understanding. If this Aegon truly carries their blood, then he bleeds red like any other man, interrupted Brandon Snow, Doran's bastard half-brother, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Dragons or no dragons, magic or no magic, the North has never knelt to southern kings, and we won't start now. Let him come with his fire-breathing lizards. We have 30,000 men who know how to fight in winter, and winter is coming. The debate continued through the night, voices rising and falling like the wind that howled constantly around Winterfell's ancient walls. Some lords counseled immediate mobilization, gathering the banners and marching south to face the Dragon King before he could consolidate his southern conquests. Others advocated defensive preparations, strengthening the next defenses and preparing for a siege that might last years. A few, the pragmatists whose families had survived 8 millennia by choosing their battles carefully, quietly suggested that perhaps accommodation might serve the North better than destruction. Torren listened to them all with a patience that had made him beloved by his bannermen. But his mind was already working through calculations that went far beyond military tactics. The North was vast but sparsely populated, rich in iron and timber but poor in gold and grain. His people were hardy and loyal, but they were also few compared to the teeming millions who lived in the fertile South. Even if they could defeat Aegon's armies, what would victory cost? How many northern sons would die to preserve an independence that might prove impossible to maintain? More troubling still were the reports that filtered in from beyond the wall, carried by rangers of the Night's Watch, who spoke in whispers of strange lights in the northern sky and sounds that had no earthly source. The ancient enemy stirred in the uttermost north, and when that enemy finally moved south, the Seven Kingdoms would need to stand united or fall separately. Perhaps the Dragon King's conquest was not mere ambition, but preparation for a war that had not yet begun. As dawn broke over Winterfell's battlements, painting the snow-covered courtyard in shades of gold and crimson, Torren made his decision. The ravens that flew south that morning carried messages that would reshape the political landscape of Westeros once again, setting in motion events that would echo through the ages. The army that assembled at the Twins was a sight to inspire awe in any who witnessed it. 30,000 Northmen in mail and leather, their breath steaming in the cold air, their banners snapping in the wind that swept down from the wall. These were not the flower knights of the Reach with their bright armor and courtly manners, nor the disciplined ranks of the Westerlands with their golden cloaks and perfect formations. These were the Sons of Winter, men who had learned warfare in the hardest school imaginable, fighting enemies that came with the darkness and the cold. Lord Walder Frey, master of the Twins and controller of the most important crossing on the Trident, watched their approach with calculating eyes. At 60 years of age, he had survived by being useful to whoever held power while avoiding commitments that might prove inconvenient later. His castle commanded the only viable crossing for large armies, making him suddenly very important to both sides in the developing conflict. 30,000, he mused to his eldest son as they stood on the battlements of the Eastern Tower. More soldiers than I've seen in 40 years of holding this bridge. The Dragon King has 10,000 at most, but he has those beasts of his, an interesting dilemma, wouldn't you say? Torren rode at the head of his host, accompanied by his most trusted bannermen, and a small group of household knights, whose families had served the Starks since the Age of Heroes. He had left his crown at Winterfell, wearing instead the simple circlet of iron and bronze that marked him as a war leader rather than a ceremonial king. The gesture was deliberate, a signal that he came not to posture, but to make the hard choices that leadership sometimes demanded. The meeting took place on the field south of the Twins, where the Green Fork meandered through water meadows that would soon run red with blood if diplomacy failed. Aegon came with a small escort, demonstrating either supreme confidence or careful calculation of the message such restraint would send. Above them, 3 dragons circled lazily through the afternoon sky, their shadows passing over the assembled armies like reminders of mortality. Your Grace, Torrin said formally as he dismounted from his destrier, offering the courtesy due to one who claimed kingship while maintaining his own dignity. The North acknowledges your victories in the South and your right to treat as an equal. What terms do you offer to those who have never bowed to foreign rule? Aegon studied the Northern king carefully, recognizing in him a different breed of ruler than those he had faced before. This was not a vain tyrant like Harren the Black, or a cautious politician like the River Lords. This was a man who ruled through earned respect rather than inherited fear, whose people followed him by choice rather than compulsion. Such men were dangerous enemies but invaluable allies. The same terms I have offered to all who yield peacefully, Aegon replied. Keep your lands, your titles, your traditions, rule the North as your fathers did, but rule it as part of a united realm. Your people will be protected, your borders will be secure, and when the long winter comes, you will not face it alone. The phrase sent a chill through the assembled Northmen that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The long winter was more than season in the North. It was prophecy and warning combined. The promise of darkness that would test every soul in Westeros. If the Dragon King understood such things, if he truly grasped the nature of the threats that lay beyond the wall, then perhaps his conquest served a purpose greater than mere ambition. Brandon Snow stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt in a gesture that was more nervous habit than threat. And if we refuse, if the North chooses to remain free, as it has always been, then we fight, Aegon said simply. My dragons will burn your castles, my armies will march through your lands, and your people will suffer for your pride. I take no pleasure in such necessity, but the realm must be won when the true war comes. I would prefer to have the North as a willing partner rather than a conquered province. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring drawn taut. 30,000 Northmen waiting to learn whether they would march home to their families or die on foreign soil for the sake of ancient pride. Lords who had never agreed on anything found themselves united in uncertainty, torn between the wisdom of submission and the honor of defiance. It was Torrin himself who broke the silence, his voice carrying clearly across the field as he spoke words that would be remembered as long as men told tales of the Conquest. I have heard the songs they sing of the last king in the North who chose death over dishonor. They call him Theon the Hungry Wolf, and they say he died bravely with his sword in his hand, and his enemies piled around him like cordwood. It makes for stirring verse, but it left his kingdom in ashes and his people enslaved. He looked around at his bannermen, these lords whose ancestors had followed Stark kings for 8,000 years, and saw understanding beginning to dawn in their eyes. I will not have songs sung of Torrin the Fool, who chose pride over prudence and left the North defenseless when the real enemy comes from beyond the wall. The realm must indeed be won when winter comes, and if that unity requires a Stark to kneel, then kneel I shall. The king who knelt, they would call him in the years to come, but those who witnessed his submission understood the courage it required. Before 30,000 of his own men and 10,000 enemies, Torrin Stark removed his crown of iron and bronze and placed it at Aegon Targaryen's feet. The North had chosen survival over pride, wisdom over glory, and in doing so had perhaps saved not just themselves, but all of Westeros from the darkness that was yet to come. In the sun-baked halls of Sunspear, where the green blood met the summer sea and palm trees swayed in the eternal heat, Princess Miriam Martell held court as her ancestors had done for 1,000 years. At 80 years of age, she remained sharp as the spears that gave her castle its name, her dark eyes bright with intelligence that had guided Dawn through decades of prosperity, while other kingdoms bled themselves white in endless wars. The Yellow Toad of Dawn, her enemies called her, but those who ruled beside her knew her as the wise, the unconquered, the princess who had made her desert kingdom a power that even dragons might fear. The throne room of Sunspear reflected the unique character of Dornish culture, where Eastern spices mingled with Western traditions, where the old blood of the Rhoynar flowed alongside that of Andals and First Men. Tapestries from Lys hung beside weapons forged in Qohor, while courtiers dressed in silk and steel moved through chambers cooled by fountains that sang with the voices of distant rivers. This was a land apart, a kingdom that had absorbed conquerors rather than yielding to them, transforming every invasion into an opportunity for growth. Princess Meria had been following the Dragon King's conquest with the keen attention of a ruler who understood that Dorne's independence depended on knowing exactly what threats approached her borders. Ravens arrived daily from the north, carrying news of burned castles and kneeling kings, of armies that melted before dragon fire and lords who chose wisdom over pride. 6 kingdoms had already fallen to Aegon Targaryen's banners, but Dorne remained unconquered as it had always been. "The North has bent the knee," announced Prince Corin, her youngest son and heir, as he entered the throne room with the latest dispatches from beyond the Red Mountains. At 45 years of age, he possessed his mother's strategic mind combined with the fierce pride that had made the Martells legendary throughout the known world. Torrhen Stark yielded his crown without a battle, choosing submission over the destruction of his people. "Wise man," Princess Meria observed, her weathered hands folding carefully over the arms of her ancient throne, though I suspect his submission was motivated by more than fear of dragons. The North has always understood threats that escape southern attention. If Torrhen Stark believes the realm must be united, then perhaps this Targaryen sees enemies we have not yet recognized. The princess had lived through 8 decades of Dornish history, witnessing the rise and fall of numerous would-be conquerors who had looked south across the Red Mountains and seen a prize worth claiming. Storm Kings and River Kings, Reach Lords and Marcher Lords, all had tried to add Dorne to their domains, and all had learned that the desert kept its own counsel. The bones of their armies fertilized the sands, while Dorne remained free. But dragons represented a different kind of threat than any Dorne had faced before. The great castles that had anchored the kingdom's defenses, strongholds like Yonwood and Skyreach that commanded the mountain passes, might prove as vulnerable to dragonfire as Harrenhal had been. The proud knights who had turned back every invasion for centuries could not fight enemies that attacked from the sky. Even the desert itself, Dorne's greatest ally, offered little protection against creatures that could fly above the burning sands. "What of our preparations?" Princess Meria asked, gesturing for her son to join her at the great map that dominated one wall of the throne room. The chart showed every oasis and wadi, every hidden path and secret stronghold that might shelter Dornish resistance if the dragons came south. "Are the supply caches ready? Have the lords been instructed in the old ways of warfare?" Prince Corin nodded grimly. "Every village between here and the Boneway has enough food and water hidden to sustain small bands for months. The lords remember the lessons their grandfathers learned fighting the Storm Kings. Strike fast, disappear faster, make the enemy chase shadows while the sun bleeds them white." The strategy that had preserved Dornish independence for a millennium was deceptively simple. When faced with superior numbers or overwhelming force, the Dornish did not meet their enemies in pitched battle where dragons might prove decisive. Instead, they melted away into the desert like mirages, striking supply trains and isolated detachments before vanishing into landscapes that could swallow armies without leaving a trace. Let the dragons burn empty castles and abandoned towns. The true strength of Dorne lay not in stones and mortar, but in the unconquerable spirit of its people. Word reached Sunspear that Aegon had dispatched ravens to every corner of Westeros, summoning the lords of the 7 kingdoms to witness his coronation at the Aegon Fort. The message that arrived for Princess Meria was courteously worded, but unmistakably clear in its implications. The Dragon King expected homage from every ruler in Westeros, and those who failed to appear would be considered in rebellion against the Iron Throne. He styles himself King of the Seven Kingdoms, Princess Meria noted with dry amusement as she read the formal invitation. A presumptuous title, considering that one of those kingdoms has never acknowledged his authority. Perhaps we should educate this young conqueror about the true nature of Dornish independence. The response she crafted was a masterpiece of diplomatic mockery, polite enough to avoid giving immediate offense but clear enough to establish Dorne's position. She regretted that pressing affairs of state prevented her attendance at the coronation, but she would be delighted to send a gift appropriate to the occasion. The present that accompanied her letter was a Dornish wine of exceptional vintage, along with a cryptic message that those familiar with Dornish history might find illuminating. The wine was indeed excellent, drawn from vineyards that had flourished in the Dornish sun for generations. But the message was the real gift, a reminder of lessons that previous conquerors had learned too late. Dorne has tasted the wine of conquest before, the accompanying note read, and found it bitter. We prefer the fruits of our own vines, grown in soil that has never bowed to foreign masters. When Rhaenys Targaryen arrived at the Dornish border with a small escort and a diplomatic mission, she found a kingdom prepared for war, but hoping for peace. The princess who had charmed lords throughout the Riverlands and won hearts in the Vale, discovered that Dornish courtesy operated by different rules than those she had mastered in the northern kingdoms. Here respect was earned through strength rather than beauty, and submission was a concept as foreign as snow in summer. The meeting took place at Euronwood, the great castle that commanded the stoneway through the Red Mountains. Lord Euronwood himself was an ancient man whose family had guarded this pass since the dawn of the Andal invasion, and his greeting to the Dragon Queen mixed formal courtesy with unmistakable warning. "Your Grace honors our humble castle with your presence," he said, as Rhaenys landed in his courtyard, Merax's silver wings folding gracefully against her sides. "Though I confess, we had not expected the pleasure of hosting dragons in our mountain halls. The climate here can be challenging for those not born to it." The subtle threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but its meaning was clear. Dragons might rule the sky, but the mountains belonged to those who had been born among them. Rhaenys understood the message and responded with diplomatic grace, but she also made sure that Merax's presence was felt throughout the negotiations. The great she-dragon's roars echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, a reminder that Targaryen power could reach even into the most remote corners of Westeros. But as the days passed and Rhaenys journeyed deeper into Dorne, she began to understand the true nature of the challenge her family faced. This was not a kingdom that could be conquered through a single decisive battle or the burning of a great castle. Dorne was an idea as much as a territory, a shared commitment to independence that ran deeper than loyalty to any individual ruler. The Dornish lords would submit if forced, but their submission would last only as long as dragon claws remained at their throats. Princess Meria received the Dragon Queen in the Water Gardens, the pleasure palace where Dornish royalty had entertained guests for centuries. Here, among pools filled with exotic fish and gardens blooming with flowers from across the narrow sea, the two women who might determine Dorne's future met as equals rather than conqueror and conquered. "Your Grace brings great beauty to our humble gardens," Princess Meria said, as they walked beside a fountain whose spray created rainbows in the afternoon sun. "Though beauty alone has never been sufficient to rule the desert, the sands are littered with the bones of those who believed otherwise." Rhaenys accepted the warning with the grace that had made her beloved throughout the other kingdoms, but privately she was beginning to understand why her brother's conquest had slowed as it approached the Dornish border. These people possessed a different kind of strength than any she had encountered, a unity forged not by fear or tradition, but by shared commitment to principles that transcended individual ambition. "Dorne has stood unconquered for 1,000 years, the Dragon Queen acknowledged, as they settled in a pavilion overlooking the palace's most beautiful garden. "But the world is changing, Your Grace. The age of 7 kingdoms ends whether Dorne participates willingly or not. The question is whether your people will help shape what comes next, or find themselves isolated as the rest of Westeros unites under Targaryen rule. An interesting perspective, Princess Meria replied, with a smile that had earned her the reputation of being the most dangerous woman in Westeros. But consider this, young queen. Dawn has prospered for centuries precisely because we have remained apart from the endless wars that have plagued the other kingdoms. We have no desire to join an empire, however benevolent its intentions. Some prizes are too costly to claim, and some kingdoms too proud to hold. The negotiations continued for days, but both women understood that they were really conducting a careful dance around an inevitable conclusion. Dawn would not submit willingly to Targaryen rule, and the Targaryens could not afford to ignore such open defiance of their authority. Yet neither side wanted the war that seemed increasingly certain, understanding that victory would come at a price that might destroy both kingdoms. When Rhaenys finally departed from Sunspear, flying north through mountain passes where Dornish spears glinted in the sun like promises of future bloodshed, she carried with her the knowledge that Aegon's conquest would remain incomplete. One kingdom would remain unconquered, one realm would continue to defy the dragon throne, and in that defiance lay the seeds of conflicts that would plague the Targaryen dynasty for generations to come. The shadow of dawn fell across Aegon's triumph, a reminder that even dragons could not force unity upon those determined to remain free. The conquest was nearly complete, but its most significant failure lay in what it could not achieve rather than what it had accomplished. The great hall of the Aegon fort had grown beyond all recognition from the simple wooden structure that had first risen on the hills above Blackwater Bay. Stonemasons from across the realm had labored for months to create something worthy of housing the first unified court in Westerosi history, their hammers ringing day and night as they shaped a vision that would endure for centuries. The walls soared 60 feet above the floor, supported by columns carved to resemble dragons frozen in stone, their eyes set with garnets that gleamed like living fire in the torchlight. But even this magnificent hall was merely preparation for the greater work that awaited. In the center of the vast space, a raised dais had been constructed to hold the most important piece of furniture ever created in the Seven Kingdoms. Here would sit the Iron Throne, the seat of power that would unite the fractured realms under a single crown, the throne that existed only in Aegon's imagination, waiting to be born from fire and the surrender of his enemies. Outside the hall, in the courtyard where Balerion often rested between flights, 1,000 swords lay piled like a metallic mountain. Each blade told a story of defeat and submission, of proud lords who had chosen wisdom over destruction and presented their weapons as tokens of fealty. Here were the great swords of House Lannister, their golden hilts gleaming despite the scratches of battle. There were the ancient blades of the Riverlords, weapons that had been carried at the field of fire and survived their owner's destruction. From the Vale came swords blessed by septons and sharpened by master smiths, while the North had contributed blades forged from iron mined beneath Winterfell itself. The weapons varied in size and quality, from simple steel to Valyrian steel that seemed to hold moonlight in its folds. Some bore the nicks and dents of countless battles, while others had been ceremonial pieces that had never tasted blood. Great two-handed swords that had required the strength of giants to wield lay beside slender rapiers designed for courtly duels. Each had been surrendered willingly by lords who understood that their submission bought not just their lives, but their continued relevance in the new order that was emerging. King Aegon stood among the surrendered weapons as the sun reached its zenith, studying the mountain of steel that represented the end of an age and the beginning of another. Tomorrow would see his coronation, the ceremony that would transform him from conqueror to king, from dragonlord to emperor. But first, the throne must be forged from the symbol of his enemy's defeat. "Are you ready, old friend?" he asked Balerion, running his hand along the great dragon's snout. The Black Dread had grown even larger during the conquest, fed on the armies of his enemies and the adulation of victory. His scales gleamed like polished obsidian, his eyes burned with the fires of old Valyria, and his wings could cast shadows that turned day to night. He was the living embodiment of Targaryen power, the creature whose flames would forge the seat of empire. The dragon's response was a rumble that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth, a sound that resonated in the bones of every man present. Balerion understood what was required of him, had perhaps been waiting for this moment since the first day they had flown west from Dragonstone. This was his purpose as much as Aegon's, the culmination of a bond between dragon and rider that had been forged in the fires of conquest. The lords who had gathered to witness the coronation watched from the battlements as history unfolded before their eyes. Here were the survivors of the conquest, the men who had chosen correctly when the choice was offered. Lord Lannister stood beside Lord Tully, former enemies united by their shared wisdom in submitting before their kingdoms burned. The young Lord Arryn held his mother's hand as she pointed out the dragon preparations, while the great lords of the north maintained their stolid dignity, despite the heat that made their furs uncomfortable. Even Lord Baratheon was present, though his wounds from the conquest still pained him. Orys had claimed Storm's End through single combat with its last king, winning both castle and crown through strength of arms rather than dragonfire. His victory had been the most traditional of the conquest, a clash of heroes that the singers would celebrate for generations. But even Orys understood that individual prowess meant nothing without the dragons that made all conquest possible. "Dracarys," Aegon commanded, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The word that had become synonymous with Targaryen power unleashed forces that transformed metal into art, warfare into statecraft, conquest into creation. Balerion's flames roared forth with temperatures that exceeded any earthly fire, turning solid steel into liquid light that flowed like water across the stone courtyard. The great swords of defeated kings became streams of molten metal, while the lesser weapons of their bannermen added their essence to the growing pool of transformed steel. But this was not the crude destruction that had characterized the conquest itself. Master smiths from across the known world had come to King's Landing to oversee this work, their knowledge combining with dragonfire to create something unprecedented in human history. Valyrian techniques that had been lost since the Doom were rediscovered through trial and error, while new methods were developed to work with metals heated beyond any previous experience. The Iron Throne took shape slowly, each fold and curve planned with meticulous care. The seat itself was wide enough to accommodate a king in full armor, while the back rose in jagged peaks that suggested both dragon wings and mountain ranges. Arms jutted from the sides at uncomfortable angles, deliberately designed to prevent casual relaxation. This would not be a comfortable seat, but a reminder of the weight of rule, the constant vigilance required to hold 7 kingdoms in unity. Most importantly, the throne incorporated elements that would make it unmistakably Targaryen, while serving as a memorial to the conquest itself. Sword hilts protruded from the armrests, their pommels carved with the sigils of surrendered houses. The steps leading up to the seat were formed from the blades of fallen kings, each one positioned so that future rulers would literally walk over the weapons of their predecessors. At the very top, where the king's head would rest, the steel was worked into patterns that resembled dragon scales, a subtle reminder of the source of Targaryen power. The forging process took hours, with multiple heatings required to shape the massive structure properly. Between each application of dragon fire, the master smiths worked frantically to guide the cooling metal into its intended form, their tools barely adequate for working with substances heated to such incredible temperatures. Apprentices stood ready with water and oil, cooling specific sections while keeping others molten, creating the complex curves and angles that would make the Iron Throne instantly recognizable throughout the known world. As the work progressed, Aegon found himself thinking not of victory, but of responsibility. Each sword that disappeared into the growing throne represented a choice made and a consequence accepted, a lord who had valued his people's survival over his own pride. The throne would serve as a constant reminder that kingship was built upon the submission of others, that every crown was forged from the defeat of those who had worn crowns before. The symbolism was deliberate and multifaceted. The Iron Throne would be uncomfortable to sit upon, its jagged edges and awkward angles ensuring that no king could rest easy in his rule. The swords of defeated enemies would serve as armrests, forcing each ruler to literally lean upon the weapons of those they had conquered. Most significantly, the throne's imposing size and angular design would dominate any room it occupied, transforming every throne room into a temple to Targaryen power. When the last flames died and the final hammer blow fell, the Iron Throne stood complete in the afternoon sun, its dark metal seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The seat of power that would endure for 3 centuries had been born, forged from the weapons of the defeated and shaped by fires that had not been seen in the world since the glory days of old Valyria. It was both beautiful and terrible, majestic and menacing, a perfect symbol for the dynasty that would rule from it. The lords who witnessed its creation understood immediately that they were looking at something that would outlive them all. This was not merely furniture, but a monument. Not just a seat, but a statement about the nature of power and the price of unity. Future kings would sit here and render judgment, make war and peace, hold court and receive homage, all while surrounded by the silent testimony of conquered enemies. Aegon approached his new throne slowly, understanding that this moment would define not just his own reign, but the reigns of all who came after him. The first time a Targaryen king sat upon the Iron Throne would establish precedents that would govern the dynasty for generations. Every gesture would be remembered, every word would be recorded, every detail would become part of the legend that surrounded House Targaryen. The seat was indeed uncomfortable, its jagged edges catching at his clothing and forcing him to sit with careful attention to his posture. The armrests were awkwardly positioned, requiring deliberate effort to use effectively. The high back made casual conversation impossible, forcing him to lean forward to address his subjects directly. Everything about the throne demanded that its occupant remain alert and engaged, never allowing the luxury of comfortable indifference. But despite its discomforts, the Iron Throne served its intended purpose perfectly. From this elevated position, Aegon could survey his entire court, his gaze carrying easily to the farthest corners of the Great Hall. The symbolism of height and dominance was unmistakable, while the visible presence of defeated weapons reminded everyone present of the consequences of defying royal authority. Most importantly, the throne's very existence proclaimed that the age of 7 kingdoms was over, replaced by something larger and more permanent. Let all who would challenge the unity of the realm look upon this seat and remember, Aegon proclaimed, as his voice echoed off the stone walls. Here rests the authority of House Targaryen, forged from the surrender of our enemies and tempered in dragonfire. From this throne we shall rule not as conquerors, but as kings, not as destroyers, but as protectors of the peace we have created. The Iron Throne was complete, and with it, the conquest of Westeros reached its symbolic culmination. Tomorrow would bring the coronation itself, but tonight belonged to contemplation of what had been achieved and what challenges lay ahead. The task of governing 6 kingdoms proved infinitely more complex than conquering them had been. In the weeks following his coronation, King Aegon found himself grappling with challenges that no amount of dragonfire could resolve. Each realm brought its own customs, its own laws, its own deeply held beliefs about justice and governance. What seemed reasonable in the Riverlands might be considered an abomination in the north, while traditions sacred to the Vale could appear barbaric to lords from the Reach. In the council chamber of the Red Keep, where morning light streamed through tall windows overlooking Blackwater Bay, the king met daily with the wisest men his realm could provide. Grand Maester Lewin had come from the citadel bearing chains that represented every field of knowledge known to the learned, while Septon Robeson spoke for the faith of the seven that dominated the southern kingdoms. Lord Orys Baratheon brought the practical wisdom of a warrior who had fought in every major battle of the Conquest, and the various regional lords contributed insights shaped by centuries of local governance. The greatest challenge lay in creating a system of laws that could serve all regions while honoring the promises Aegon had made during his conquest. He had sworn to respect local customs and traditions, but some of those customs directly contradicted each other. The North followed the old gods and their harsh but simple justice, while the southern kingdoms answered to the Seven and their more complex moral codes. The Ironborn had their own concept of honor based on strength and taking, while the Dornish celebrated principles of equality between men and women that scandalized more traditional lords. "We cannot simply impose Valyrian law upon Westeros," Aegon observed, as he studied reports from across his realm. "Our ancestors ruled through fear and fire, but we must govern through consent and wisdom. The dragons gave us the power to conquer, but they cannot give us the authority to rule justly." The religious question proved particularly thorny. The faith of the Seven commanded the loyalty of most southern lords, but the North clung to their ancient worship of nameless gods whose faces were carved in heart trees. The Ironborn honored the drowned god with ceremonies that involved ritual drowning, while scattered followers of Eastern religions brought their own practices from across the narrow sea. Some septons called for the suppression of all non-Seven faiths, while northern lords threatened rebellion if their religious freedom was curtailed. King Aegon's solution demonstrated the political wisdom that would make his dynasty endure for centuries. Rather than favoring one faith over others, he declared that all would be tolerated within his realm, provided they did not threaten the peace or demand human sacrifice. The Sept of Remembrance was built in King's Landing to honor the Seven, but a godswood was planted beside it, where Northmen could pray beneath heart trees. Even the Ironborn were permitted their drowning ceremonies, though they were required to ensure their subjects survived the experience. Let every man pray to whatever gods brought his ancestors comfort, Aegon proclaimed in his first great decree. The realm is large enough for many faiths, and our rules strong enough to protect them all. Only let no god demand the death of innocents, and let no priest claim authority over kings. The establishment of marriage laws required equally delicate navigation between competing traditions. The southern kingdoms followed Andal customs that allowed polygamy only for kings, while the north maintained first men traditions of single marriage bonds. The Dornish practiced equal inheritance between sons and daughters, while other regions followed strict male primogeniture. Some houses had practiced cousin marriage for generations to preserve bloodlines, while others considered such unions cursed by the gods. The compromise that emerged became known as the Great Marriage Decree, establishing that all existing marriages would be honored, regardless of the customs under which they had been contracted. But future unions must follow standardized procedures overseen by either septons or recognized local authorities. Polygamy would remain legal only for House Targaryen, a privilege that acknowledged their unique status as dragon kings, while preventing other lords from accumulating dangerous power through multiple alliances. Trade regulations presented their own complexities, as each kingdom had developed different systems of weights and measures, currency standards, and commercial law. The North dealt primarily in barter and iron coins, while the Reach used gold standards inherited from ancient Gardener kings. The Riverlands had adopted a complex system of river tolls that funded local infrastructure, while the Vale maintained strict controls on the export of their valuable minerals. King Aegon ordered the creation of a unified currency system based on golden dragons, silver stags, and copper pennies, with consistent weights and purities enforced throughout the realm. Royal mints were established in major cities to ensure proper coinage, while appointed magistrates gained authority to resolve commercial disputes according to standardized procedures. The old regional currencies would remain valid for local transactions, but all royal taxes and major contracts must be conducted in the new unified system. The question of criminal justice proved most challenging of all, as different regions maintained vastly different concepts of appropriate punishment for similar crimes. Northern lords favored swift execution for serious offenses, believing that clean death served justice better than prolonged suffering. Southern kingdoms preferred more elaborate punishments that matched the nature of the crime, while also maintaining complex systems of monetary compensation for victims and their families. The legal code that emerged attempted to balance these competing philosophies while establishing royal authority over the most serious offenses. Murder, treason, rape, and theft above certain thresholds became crown crimes subject to standardized penalties, while lesser offenses remained under local jurisdiction. Lords retained the right to dispense justice within their own lands, but appeals could be made to regional governors appointed by the Iron Throne. Most importantly, the new laws established the concept of royal justice that transcended local prejudices. Any subject of the crown could petition the king directly if they believed they had been wronged by local authorities, creating a system of checks and balances that prevented the worst abuses of feudal power. The right of trial by combat was preserved for those who claimed it, but alternative procedures were established for those too weak or poor to defend themselves through violence. The creation of the Kingsguard represented Aegon's most innovative contribution to Westerosi governance. 7 knights of unquestioned honor and skill would be sworn to protect the king and royal family, serving for life with vows of celibacy and poverty that prevented them from pursuing personal ambitions. Unlike regular guards who served for pay or political advancement, the Kingsguard would have no loyalties beyond their sacred oaths to the crown. The first 7 knights chosen for this honor represented every region of the realm, demonstrating that loyalty to the Iron Throne transcended local allegiances. Sir Corlys Velaryon came from the ancient Valyrian nobility, while Sir Gawain Corbry brought Vale honor to the White Cloaks. The North contributed Sir Willem Dustin, whose family had served the Starks for centuries before transferring their loyalty to the Dragon Crown. Each knight surrendered his name, his lands, his family connections, and his personal desires to become a living symbol of unified royal authority. The economic implications of unification extended far beyond simple currency reform. For the first time in centuries, merchants could travel from Winterfell to Old Town without paying dozens of separate tolls or navigating conflicting trade regulations. The construction of royal roads connecting major cities created opportunities for commerce that had never existed before, while standardized legal procedures reduced the risks that had previously made long-distance trade prohibitively dangerous. King Aegon also established the principle of royal taxation that would fund the unified government while respecting regional capabilities. The fertile Reach would contribute more grain than the harsh north, but northern iron and timber would flow south to balance the exchange. The Westerlands would provide gold to fund royal projects, while the Riverlands offered their strategic position as a transportation hub. Even Dorne, though officially independent, found itself drawn into these economic relationships through unofficial trade agreements. The royal progress became an essential tool for maintaining unity across such a vast realm. Each year the king would travel to different regions, holding court in various castles, hearing petitions from local lords, and demonstrating that royal authority extended to every corner of the 7 kingdoms. These progresses also served as opportunities for the king to better understand regional concerns and adjust his policies accordingly. The establishment of a royal navy marked another crucial development in unified governance. The Iron Islands' maritime expertise was redirected from raiding to protecting merchant shipping, while the royal fleet based at King's Landing could project power along any coastline in the realm. Former iron-born reavers became royal captains, their knowledge of wind and tide serving the crown that had conquered their homes. By the end of his first year as king, Aegon had created something unprecedented in Westerosi history. not merely a confederation of allied kingdoms, but a genuine nation with shared laws, common currency, unified military command, and centralized royal authority. The dragons had won the conquest, but human wisdom had secured the peace that followed, establishing foundations that would support 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The unique arrangement of Aegon's marriage to both his sisters created unprecedented challenges in establishing royal protocol for the new dynasty. Never before in Westerosi history had a kingdom been ruled by 3 equal monarchs sharing power according to their individual strengths and interests. The traditional model of a single king with a supporting queen could not accommodate the complex dynamic that had emerged among the 3 dragon riders, requiring entirely new approaches to governance and diplomacy. Queen Visenya commanded respect through her mastery of warfare and law. Her keen intellect focused on the practical mechanisms of maintaining order across 6 kingdoms. In the morning hours she could be found in the castle's training yards, sparring with knights who had distinguished themselves during the conquest or drilling with newer recruits who sought to prove their worth to the crown. Her skill with Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had belonged to their ancestors, remained unmatched by any warrior in the realm, and her tactical knowledge had been crucial to several victories during the conquest. But Visenya's true genius lay in her understanding of justice and administration. She spent long hours reviewing legal disputes from across the realm, her decisions consistently demonstrating both wisdom and fairness that won grudging respect even from those who had initially questioned her authority. When local lords brought complex inheritance disputes or boundary disagreements to the royal court, they soon learned that Queen Visenya possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of precedent and custom that allowed her to craft solutions satisfying all parties. Her establishment of the royal law schools represented one of her most lasting contributions to the realm. Young men from noble houses could study at King's Landing under the Queen's personal supervision, learning the principles of unified justice that would govern the 7 kingdoms. These graduates returned to their home regions as royal magistrates, carrying with them consistent interpretations of the King's law that helped reduce the friction between local customs and central authority. Queen Rhaenys pursued different interests that proved equally vital to the dynasty's success. Where Visenya enforced royal will through strength and legal precedent, Rhaenys won hearts through her patronage of arts and music, her genuine interest in the welfare of common people, and her ability to make even the proudest lords feel valued and heard. Her court became the cultural center of the realm, attracting musicians, poets, painters, and craftsmen from across the known world. The Queen's daily routine included regular audiences with merchants, artisans, and other common folk who would never have gained access to royal attention under previous monarchs. She listened to their concerns about trade regulations, working conditions, and local governance with the same careful attention she gave to the petitions of great lords. Her ability to remember names, faces, and personal details created a network of loyalty that extended far beyond the noble houses into the very foundations of society. Rhaenys also pioneered the practice of royal charity that would become a hallmark of Targaryen rule. She established orphanages in major cities, funded by royal taxes but administered by local septons and maesters. Hospitals bearing the royal dragon were built to care for the sick and injured, while royal granaries maintained emergency food supplies that could be distributed during times of famine or natural disaster. These institutions served both humanitarian purposes and practical political goals, demonstrating that the Iron Throne cared for all its subjects rather than merely exploiting them. The Queen's famous beauty became a diplomatic asset as well as a personal blessing. Foreign ambassadors who might have approached King Aegon with suspicion and calculation found themselves charmed by Queen Rhaenys's grace and intelligence. Her ability to speak multiple languages, learned during her childhood on Dragonstone, allowed her to communicate directly with representatives from the free cities, while her knowledge of Eastern customs helped establish profitable trade relationships that enriched the entire realm. King Aegon himself served as the stable center around which his queen's different energies could orbit effectively. His gift for delegation allowed him to assign responsibilities according to each queen's particular talents, while maintaining overall strategic direction. When Viseria's harsh justice needed tempering with mercy, Rhaenys could intervene with suggestions that preserved both legal precedent and human compassion. When Rhaenys's generosity threatened to exceed the royal treasury's capacity, Viseria could craft practical limitations that achieved charitable goals within sustainable budgets. The three-way dynamic created a system of internal checks and balances that prevented any single personality from dominating royal policy. Aegon's decisions were informed by both Viseria's practical analysis and Rhaenys's understanding of popular sentiment, while the queens could pursue their individual interests with the security of knowing that their husband would prevent either approach from becoming extreme or counterproductive. This balance became particularly evident during the royal progresses that took the court to different regions each year. Viseria would focus her attention on meeting with local magistrates, reviewing legal procedures, and ensuring that royal justice was being administered fairly and consistently. Her presence reassured lords who worried about maintaining order in their domains, while her expertise in military matters helped resolve disputes over boundaries and inheritance that might otherwise have led to private wars. Rhaenys, meanwhile, would immerse herself in the cultural and economic life of each region, visiting markets and workshops, attending local festivals, and commissioning works from regional artists. Her genuine appreciation for local traditions and customs helped bridge the gap between the central authority of King's Landing and the diverse heritage of the various kingdoms. Lords who might have resented southern interference found themselves proud to show off their region's unique character to a queen who clearly valued and understood their contributions to the realm. The sisters' different approaches to diplomacy proved especially valuable when dealing with foreign powers who remained uncertain about the new unified kingdom's intentions. When the Prince of Pentos sent ambassadors to negotiate trade agreements, Viseria handled the formal legal aspects, while Rhaenys managed the cultural exchange that made the partnership personally meaningful to both sides. Similarly, when tensions arose with Braavos over fishing rights in the Narrow Sea, the combined diplomatic effort of both queens achieved resolution that might have eluded traditional single-ruler negotiations. Their roles in training the next generation of Targaryen leadership became increasingly important as the dynasty established itself. Young Prince Aenys, son of Aegon and Rhaenys, learned statecraft through observing his mother's interactions with common folk and foreign dignitaries. His half-brother Magor, born to Viseria, absorbed lessons in military command and legal reasoning through accompanying his mother on official duties. The boys' different temperaments were shaped by their mother's contrasting approaches, creating complementary skills that would serve the dynasty well in future generations. The queen's influence extended beyond the royal family to shape the broader culture of the unified realm. Viseria's emphasis on merit over birth in legal appointments encouraged talented individuals from humble backgrounds to seek advancement through royal service. Her establishment of standardized legal education created a class of professional administrators whose loyalty was to the crown rather than to regional noble houses. Rhaenys's cultural patronage, meanwhile, began the process of creating a distinctly Westerosi artistic tradition that blended elements from all the conquered kingdoms. Musicians from the north learned to incorporate rich melodies into their traditional ballads, while Dornish dance forms gained popularity in the Riverlands. The royal court became a melting pot where regional differences were celebrated rather than suppressed, fostering a sense of shared identity that transcended ancient tribal divisions. The economic impact of the queen's different focuses also proved significant. Viseria's legal reforms reduced corruption and improved the efficiency of tax collection, while her military expertise helped suppress the banditry that had plagued trade routes for centuries. Rhaenys's charitable institutions and cultural investments stimulated urban growth and attracted skilled craftsmen to King's Landing, transforming the city from a modest port into a genuine rival to Old Town and Lannisport. Perhaps most importantly, the three-ruler arrangement demonstrated that effective governance required multiple perspectives and complementary skills rather than the unchecked authority of a single monarch. The system worked because all three participants possessed both the wisdom to recognize their own limitations and the trust to delegate authority to partners whose judgment they respected. This collaborative approach to royal power would influence Targaryen governance for generations, establishing precedents that would shape how future kings and queens understood their responsibilities to the realm. The transformation of Westeros under Targaryen rule extended far beyond the mere political unification of formerly independent kingdoms. Within a single generation, the conquest had fundamentally altered the economic, cultural, and social fabric of an entire continent, creating ripple effects that would influence the development of civilization for centuries to come. The age of petty kings and endless local wars had ended, replaced by something unprecedented in the annals of human history. Trade flourished as never before in the memory of living men. Merchants who had once required armed escorts and expensive bribes to cross a dozen different borders could now travel freely from the wall to the reach under the protection of royal law. The great roads that connected major cities became arteries of commerce, carrying goods and ideas across distances that had previously seemed insurmountable. Northern furs found their way to Dornish markets, while Dornish wines graced tables in the coldest keeps beyond the neck. The economic integration created opportunities for prosperity that had been impossible under the old system of fragmented kingdoms. Craftsmen could specialize in producing goods for markets they had never previously accessed, while farmers could focus on crops best suited to their soil and climate, rather than trying to be self-sufficient in all things. The efficiency gains were enormous, leading to population growth and urbanization that accelerated the pace of technological and cultural development throughout the realm. King's Landing itself embodied these changes, growing from a modest fishing village to rival the greatest cities of the known world within decades of the conquest. The influx of people seeking opportunities in the new capital created a cosmopolitan atmosphere where traditions from all six kingdoms mingled and evolved. Northern stonemasons worked alongside Reach carpenters, while Dornish spice merchants established shops next to iron-born sea captains who had turned to legitimate trade. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency facilitated not just commerce, but also the exchange of knowledge and ideas. Mesetters could share their research more easily when their calculations used consistent units, while craftsmen could replicate techniques developed in distant regions when they could rely on uniform standards. The citadel itself began to evolve, with new chains of study created to reflect areas of learning that had emerged from the increased interaction between different cultures. Religious evolution represented another profound consequence of unification. While King Aegon had guaranteed freedom of worship for all faiths, the practical reality of different traditions existing side by side led to gradual synthesis and adaptation. Northern lords who visited King's Landing often attended services at the Sept of Remembrance out of courtesy, while southern knights traveling north sometimes participated in ceremonies before heart trees as a mark of respect for their hosts. The faith of the Seven began incorporating elements that acknowledged the validity of other spiritual traditions, while the old gods of the North seemed more accessible to Southerners who encountered them in contexts of hospitality rather than conquest. Even the more exotic religious practices brought by immigrants from across the narrow sea found their place in the diverse spiritual landscape of unified Westeros. Marriage patterns shifted dramatically as the artificial barriers between kingdoms dissolved. Great houses that had been enemies for generations discovered the advantages of alliance through matrimony, while lesser lords found opportunities to advance their station by marrying into families from distant regions. The Targaryen example of incestuous marriage remained unique to the royal family, but the broader principle of strategic marriage as a tool of unity became widely adopted throughout the nobility. These new marriage networks created loyalties that transcended regional boundaries. gradually replacing the old system of purely local allegiances with more complex webs of relationship that bound the entire realm together. A lord might find himself related by marriage to families in 3 different former kingdoms, making rebellion against the central authority not just impractical but personally devastating to his own extended family. The legal revolution initiated by Queen Visinia's reforms created a class of professional administrators whose expertise became increasingly valuable as the realm grew more complex. These royal magistrates, trained in unified legal principles but sensitive to local customs, served as crucial links between the Iron Throne and the diverse populations it governed. Their career advancement depended on merit and royal favor rather than birth or regional connections, creating a new avenue for social mobility that had not existed under the old system. The establishment of royal institutions also provided opportunities for advancement that drew talented individuals from across the realm to King's Landing. The expanded Kingsguard, the growing Royal Navy, the diplomatic corps that managed relationships with foreign powers, and the administrative bureaucracy that kept the kingdom functioning, all required skilled personnel who could be recruited from any region regardless of their family connections. Cultural flowering accompanied political and economic integration as artists and intellectuals gained access to audiences and patrons they could never have reached under the fragmented system. The royal court's patronage of learning attracted scholars from the free cities and beyond, while the safety of travel allowed for cultural exchange that enriched regional traditions rather than replacing them. Northern ballads gained southern melodies, while rich love songs incorporated the stark emotional honesty characteristic of iron-born sea shanties. The preservation and documentation of knowledge became a royal priority, as King Aegon recognized that unity required understanding the diverse heritage of all his subjects. Royal chroniclers worked to record the histories, customs, and achievements of each region, creating a comprehensive understanding of Westerosi civilization that had never existed when the kingdoms remained isolated from each other. The Great Library of the Red Keep became a repository of learning that rivaled the Citadel itself. Military innovation flourished under the new system, as commanders could draw upon tactical knowledge and strategic insights from all the former kingdoms. The disciplined formations favored by the Westerlands were combined with the individual prowess of northern warriors and the mobility tactics perfected by the Dornish. Naval warfare evolved as iron-born expertise merged with the resources and shipbuilding capabilities of the other coastal regions. The dragons themselves became symbols not just of royal power, but of the unity that transcended human limitations. Children who had grown up hearing only local legends now learned stories that connected their heritage to the broader tapestry of Westerosi history. The sight of dragons flying overhead reminded all subjects that they were part of something larger than their immediate community, citizens of a realm that stretched from the frozen wastes beyond the wall to the burning sands of the Red Mountains. Population mobility increased dramatically as people gained the freedom to relocate without crossing hostile borders or navigating complex immigration procedures. Younger sons who faced limited opportunities in their home regions could seek their fortunes in distant kingdoms, while skilled craftsmen could establish themselves wherever their talents might be most valued. This internal migration helped spread innovations and cultural practices throughout the realm while reducing the social tensions that had previously built up in areas with limited economic opportunities. The transformation of the Iron Islands from a raiding culture to an integral part of the realm's economy demonstrated the Conquest's power to redirect destructive energies toward constructive purposes. Former reavers became the backbone of the Royal Navy, their unmatched seamanship serving to protect rather than threaten the prosperity of coastal communities. The wealth that had once been extracted through violence now flowed through legitimate trade and royal service. Agricultural improvements spread rapidly as farmers gained access to techniques and crops that had been developed in other regions. The long growing seasons of the Reach could support northern grains that matured quickly, while hardy vegetables developed in harsh northern climates could provide security against crop failures in more temperate areas. The sharing of agricultural knowledge helped increase food production throughout the realm, supporting the population growth that accompanied economic expansion. The establishment of royal roads also facilitated the spread of ideas and innovations at unprecedented speed. News that had once taken months to travel between distant regions could now cross the continent in weeks, while urgent royal communications could be transmitted even faster through the Raven network maintained by the Meisters. This improved communication helped prevent the misunderstandings and rumors that had often escalated into conflicts under the old system. Perhaps most importantly, the Conquest created a sense of shared destiny that transcended the ancient divisions between the various peoples of Westeros. While regional identities remained strong and local traditions were preserved, there emerged a broader understanding of common interests and mutual dependence that made large-scale civil war far less likely than it had been under the fragmented system of independent kingdoms. The legacy of Aegon's conquest would prove to be not just political unity, but cultural synthesis, economic integration, and social transformation that created something genuinely new in the world. The Seven Kingdoms had become one realm, not just in name, but in the daily reality of millions of people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the vision of three dragon riders from a lonely island in the narrow sea. As evening settled over the Red Keep like a gentle blanket, King Aegon found himself alone in the throne room, where the Iron Throne cast long shadows across the polished stone floor. The great hall that had witnessed the pageantry of coronation and the deliberations of court now stood empty save for the solitary figure of the first Targaryen king. In these quiet moments after the day's audiences had concluded and the petitioners had departed, he could hear the distant sounds of his city settling into the rhythms of peaceful night. Through the tall windows that overlooked Blackwater Bay, the lights of King's Landing twinkled like fallen stars scattered across the darkening landscape. Fishermen were returning from their daily labors, their nets full of the silver harvest that the sea provided without fail. Merchants were closing their shops and counting the day's profits, while craftsmen put away their tools and joined their families for evening meals. Children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of parents who no longer feared that war might come with the dawn. The transformation was profound and deeply satisfying to witness. Where once seven kingdoms had maintained armies poised for constant conflict, now a single realm enjoyed the fruits of sustained peace. The borders that had been marked by watchtowers and fortified crossing points were now distinguished only by changes in local customs and dialects. Trade routes that had required military escorts were traveled safely by merchants accompanied only by their apprentices and pack animals. Balerion's distant roar echoed across the bay as the great dragon settled onto his favorite perch atop Aegonford's highest tower. Even in rest, the Black Dread remained a symbol of the power that had made unity possible, his presence a reminder to any who might contemplate rebellion that the price of defiance remained as terrible as ever. Yet increasingly, that reminder seemed unnecessary as the benefits of unified rule became apparent to even the most skeptical former enemies. King Aegon rose from the Iron Throne and walked slowly to the windows, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast chamber. The seat of power that had been forged from 1,000 surrendered swords would endure long after he was gone, occupied by sons and grandsons who would face challenges he could not yet imagine. The realm he had created would grow and change, adapting to circumstances that remained hidden in the mists of an unknowable future. The prophetic dreams that had driven him to conquest still visited his sleep occasionally, but they had evolved from urgent warnings into something more complex and nuanced. He still saw the darkness advancing from the far north, still witnessed the battles between ice and fire that would test his descendants. But now he also saw the strength that unity had created, the resources and resolve that would be available when the true test finally came. The great work was not complete, would perhaps never be truly complete. Dawn remained independent, its princes and princesses maintaining their ancient autonomy despite all diplomatic overtures. The Iron Islands, though technically conquered, retained a culture of violence that occasionally erupted into unauthorized raids that required swift correction. Even within the unified kingdoms, ancient feuds and regional tensions simmered beneath the surface of imposed peace. But the foundation had been laid for something greater than any single monarch could achieve. The institutions that Queen Visenya had established would outlast her personal authority, while the cultural synthesis that Queen Rhaenys had fostered would continue to strengthen the bonds between formerly hostile populations. The legal framework that governed the realm could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the core principles that made justice possible across such diverse territories. King Aegon thought of his young sons, Prince Aenys and Prince Maegor, who were growing up in a world their father had created, but which they would inherit as their natural birthright. They would never know the desperate urgency that had driven the conquest, never experience the weight of decision that had rested on 3 dragon riders staring across the narrow sea at an unconquered continent. For them, the 7 kingdoms would simply be home, a unified realm that had always existed in their experience. The responsibility of preparing them for the challenges they would face weighed heavily on his mind. During these quiet evening hours, Atenus possessed his mother's gentle nature and artistic sensibilities, qualities that would serve him well in times of peace but might prove inadequate if the realm faced serious threats. Maegor had inherited Visenya's martial spirit and strategic mind, making him a formidable warrior, but perhaps lacking the diplomatic skills that effective kingship required. Perhaps that was as it should be, Aegon reflected as he watched the last light fade from the western sky. The conquest had required one kind of king, while the consolidation of power demanded different qualities entirely. Future challenges would call forth their own leaders, individuals shaped by their times and equipped with the particular strengths that circumstances would demand. The bloodline would endure, but each generation would face its trials with whatever gifts the gods had granted them. The city below had grown quiet as its inhabitants settled into sleep, but the king remained wakeful, his thoughts turning to the broader implications of what had been accomplished. For the first time in recorded history, the entire continent of Westeros lay under unified rule. The ancient dream of conquerors from the Age of Heroes had finally been realized, not through the gradual expansion of a single kingdom, but through the sudden application of overwhelming force that made resistance futile. Yet the true measure of the conquest's success would not be determined by military victory, but by the durability of the peace that followed. Could institutions created in a single generation provide stability for centuries? Would the bonds forged through shared governance prove stronger than the tribal loyalties that had divided the realm for millennia? Only time would provide answers to such questions, but the early signs offered reasons for cautious optimism. The dragons circling overhead in the star-filled darkness served as living symbols of the power that had made unity possible, but they also represented continuity with forces larger than human ambition. The blood of old Valyria flowed in Targaryen veins, connecting the new dynasty to an ancient tradition of dragon mastery that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history. When the last dragon finally died, as mortal creatures must, would the realm they had helped create prove capable of governing itself without the fear that kept rebellious impulses in check? These were questions for future generations to answer, problems for sons and grandsons to solve. King Aegon's responsibility was to establish foundations strong enough to support whatever structures his descendants might choose to build. The legal framework was in place. The economic integration was proceeding smoothly, and the cultural synthesis was creating new forms of identity that transcended ancient divisions. As midnight approached and the Red Keep settled into the deep quiet that preceded dawn, King Aegon finally turned away from the windows and walked slowly back toward his private chambers. The Iron Throne would wait for tomorrow's petitioners, its uncomfortable edges and twisted metal serving their intended purpose of keeping rulers alert to the weight of their responsibilities. Outside his window, the great city slept peacefully under dragon protection, its people secure in the knowledge that morning would bring another day of prosperity and safety. Farmers in distant fields slumbered without fear that their harvests might be burned by raiding armies, while merchants dreamed of profits from trade routes that remained permanently open. Children would wake to a world where their futures were limited only by their talents and ambitions, rather than the accidents of birth and geography. The realm would endure because it served the needs of its people better than the chaos that had preceded it. Unity was not just a political abstraction, but a daily reality that touched every life in practical ways. The song of ice and fire that had haunted Aegon's dreams was far from over, but the melody had shifted from desperate warning to cautious hope. The realm was ready for whatever trials awaited, strengthened by the peace that dragons had won and wisdom had preserved. In the growing light of dawn, King Aegon Targaryen, first of his name, closed his eyes and found the dreamless sleep that came to those who had completed the work they were born to accomplish.